Hello and welcome back to my channel, What If Deku 2.0. Join us as we delve into the realms of fanfiction and fantasy, bringing you the best stories and discussions. Today, we're kicking off part 7 of our series, What If Deku Unleashed Godlike Powers and Surpassed All? If you enjoy this video, please give it a like and subscribe for more content in the future. The author of this story is DripBayless from FanfictionNet. All the relevant links are in the description. Feel free to say hello to the author on their profile. Now, let's dive into the fanfic. The lead up to their final exams was a mixed bag for Class 1A. For those near the bottom of the class rankings, such as Ashido and Kaminari, it was a tumultuous nightmare with direct implications on their eligibility for summer training camp. For those near the top of the rankings, such as Izuku, Shoto, and Yaoyorozu, it was business as usual, although Yaoyorozu was admittedly dreading the practical exam. Ultimately, though, everyone was on a mission to prepare as best as they could for the written and practical tests in order to be allowed passage to the training camp. Izuku wasn't particularly worried about the exams, provided the written portion wasn't designed by Nezu himself specifically to mess with him. He was confident in his ability to ace it. The practical would likely be more challenging, but he didn't anticipate anything that he wouldn't be able to handle, especially after the circus that had been their semester. Many of his classmates, on the other hand, did not share his confidence. "I'm a little worried about the practical," Toru lamented at their lunch table. "Aizawa won't tell us much about what to expect, just that it's comprehensive. That could mean robots, rescue training, or actual combat against other people," Sue added next to her while picking at her food. "Or some combination of all of them." "Did your mom give you information about the exams?" Ochako asked the absent-mindedly eating Izuku across from her. "Nah, she was pretty tight-lipped about it when I floated the topic," he shrugged, much to her dismay. He paused with his chopsticks and put the soba noodles back into his dish before looking up. "Completely off topic, but how does your invisibility work, Toru? Does all light pass through you as if you weren't actually there? And how do you see if that's the case?" Toru acknowledged before the question caught up with her and she put her chopsticks down. "Oh, light doesn't just pass through me entirely. Otherwise, I'd be blind, like you said. I just refract almost all of the light I come into contact with at any given moment. The amount that I don't refract is so negligible that I'm pretty much invisible to anything short of heat sensors and black lights. My own eyes are immune to it, though I can see myself below the neck. I just don't show up in mirrors or on camera." "That small fraction of light that you don't refract," Izuku began, now completely invested in the conversation upon learning about the intricacies of a quirk. "Is it a fixed percentage, or does it change?" "It can fluctuate," she answered. "Under very specific conditions and at very specific angles, I am visible to the average naked eye. That rarely ever happens, though. And beyond that, you'd only be detected with an infrared or UV sensor since you don't refract those parts of the electromagnetic spectrum," Izuku concluded, and Sue, Ochako, and Ida also found themselves invested in the conversation. Shoto, meanwhile, continued eating away at his bowl of katsudon. "Pretty much, yeah," Toru confirmed with an unseen nod. "Fascinating," Izuku remarked while scribbling away in his notebook that the 5 other occupants of the table were absolutely certain was not there mere moments prior. "If you can see yourself but don't show up in the mirror, what do you do with your hair?" Ochako posed to her invisible friend. "Who says I have any?" Toru posed in return with a glimmer of mirth in her tone. "I could tell you that I inherited the physical traits of my dad's chameleon mutation, and you'd never actually know if I'm lying or not." "That's fair," Ochako conceded. "So, your father has a chameleon mutation. What about your mother?" Ida chimed in. "She's bioluminescent, but she can turn hers on and off, unlike me," she answered. "Her dad could also go invisible, but he could only do it for minutes at a time. I guess I inherited a permanent version from him. I don't really know. Quirks are weird." "Understatement of the year," Izuku chuckled before ducking his head out of the way of an errant elbow from a student walking behind him. "Oh, sorry," came the decidedly unapologetic drawl of Nido Monoma. "Your head's so big that it's hard to miss." "No worries, I've got nothing against the visually impaired," Izuku assured in a manner that the others seated couldn't accurately determine the iniquity of. Monoma's eye lightly twitched at the perceived jab as well as the light snort from the seated Todoroki. "You three encountered the hero killer," he stated with little fanfare, and the silence and newfound attention he received from two of the three boys in question caused his haughty smirk to return. "Class 1 really isn't content with not being the center of attention, huh? You do realize that you're not actually in the spotlight because people think you're competent heroes, or because you're worthy, or anything that absurd, right?" Now he had the full attention of 56 THS of the table, and the sight of Ochako glowering at him only served to embolden him. "The reality is that you all are damsels in distress that keep wandering into trouble. So here's a little food for thought. What happens when the rest of us are caught up in the messes you all create, and we become unwilling victims to whatever horrible villains you decide to rain down upon us?" Monoma, so wrapped up in his rant, did not notice Kendo stomping up to him with the intent of knocking him out for antagonizing the other class. However, before she could touch him, her wrist was wrapped up in soft, purple rope like flame, and she followed it in surprise to Izuku casually extending it from his index finger. Monoma was taken out of his rant when he realized what had happened, and he looked back and forth between his bewildered classmate behind him and the seemingly unbothered Izuku in his seat. "I didn't even," Monoma quietly began, but Izuku cut him off. "You didn't notice? And that's exactly the problem, isn't it?" Izuku casually remarked from his seat as he killed the flame. "I'm right in front of you, you're looking right at me, and I still managed to catch you by surprise. That's not even to mention the fact that you didn't notice Kendo's approach at all." Monoma's look of surprise transformed into a sneer, and Izuku sighed before giving the boy a pointed glare. "If and when the day comes where we drag you all into our mess, then the hope would be that you guys can handle yourselves just as well as us. If you are really as good as you claim yourself to be, and if the perceived gulf between 1A and 1B is as overblown as you claim it is, then you shouldn't have much trouble surviving the same near-death experiences that we all did, right?" "Move it, Monoma," Kendo growled. "You've been enough of an asshole for the year already after that display." Monoma only scoffed and walked away from the table, and Kendo sighed. "Sorry about him, again," she genuinely offered. "He's been really deep into his 1B superiority SH stick since internships ended." "It's all good," Izuku waved it off. "Finals are on us and tensions will inevitably run high." "Speaking of finals, I heard from one of my friends who's a third year that it'll be combat against robots like the entrance exam," Kendo revealed. "Seriously?" Ochako asked, and Sue, Toru, and Ida were just as surprised at the coveted info. "It's only what I heard, but it's better than going in blind," Kendo shrugged. Izuku wasn't entirely convinced. Fighting more robots would be much too simple, and it wouldn't really test them on anything beyond their destructive capabilities, which the entrance exam and sports festival both already tested. He suspected that Principal Nezu had something else in mind for them, but it was ultimately pointless to speculate. They'd find out when they found out. It was then that Shoto brought his attention away from his meal, and he turned to look at Izuku. "I think I like katsudon almost as much as soba." "Really?" Izuku asked with a bright smile. "Glad to have another enlightened soul in this world." Shoto nodded, and he looked to Izuku's soba. "How was yours?" "Definitely in my top 3, Izuku confirmed, and Shoto gave his friend a small smile. The 3 days of written exams came and went, and, ready or not, the practical exam was finally upon them. Class 1 stood before the teachers of UA in their costumes, and they were mostly psyched up for whatever was to come. "Now then, let's begin the last test," Aizawa instructed to the assembled students, and only Izuku noticed that his scarf was more bulbous than usual. "Keep in mind that you can, in fact, Fail this final if you make any stupid mistakes. Your attendance at training camp depends on this. Aizawa fixed them all with a firm glare. Now, I expect that you all have tried to gather information about what you'll be facing today, but curb your expectations because they're most likely inaccurate. The bulge in his scarf moved, and out popped their principal. This year's test will have a new focus: hero work, of course, but also teamwork, critical thinking, and combat against actual humans. You all will be working together in pairs against one of our esteemed UA teachers. That caught the class completely by surprise. Not only were robots not on the menu, but they'd be facing their very own instructors who were actual pro heroes with loads of actual experience. Those who were previously eased into a robot-induced false sense of security were swiftly snatched out of it, and it only heightened when Aizawa revealed that their partners and opponents had already been selected for them. First up, Midoriya will be paired with Bakugo, Aizawa announced, and Izuku's eyes widened a fraction whereas Bakugo didn't quite know how to feel. Your opponent, Aizawa trailed off, and a loud, boisterous laughter erupted from above the building they were all standing in front of. I am here, All Might shouted as he vaulted over the building and landed in front of the shocked students. Izuku and Bakugo had very different reactions to the prospect of battling the #1 hero. Bakugo was grinning madly at the idea of doing direct battle with the greatest hero of all time and proving himself once and for all. Izuku, meanwhile, was both unnerved that arguably the most powerful man alive would be attacking them and somewhat excited to be able to cut loose against an opponent that could most certainly take it. Sitting at her desk in an office at Ketsubotsu, Miss Joke was nearing the end of grading her students' final exams. Suddenly, her hand froze in the middle of a question, and her eye began to twitch. I'm gonna skin that bunny for corrupting my intern. To introduce your opponent, All Might finished with his signature grin. Just like that, Bakugo's own grin vanished and irritation took over. Izuku, while a mixture of relieved and mildly disappointed, looked on curiously for who their opponent would actually be. He took stock of the assembled teachers, and just about everyone short of Recovery Girl was present. It wouldn't make sense for All Might to show up just to introduce someone who was already standing there and could have just introduced themselves, and he doubted that they would fight Recovery Girl. That only left. Oh no. On cue, as if Metatabi was playing a cruel prank on him, a slender form in a black unitard stepped out from the shadows and around All Might. The dark green boots, utility belt, gloves, and hair came into view, and one thought simultaneously ran through the heads of both boys: shit. That would be me, Verdant announced to the pale duo of Izuku and Bakugo. Come on, can we get All Might instead? Izuku almost pleaded to his homeroom teacher. No, he succinctly denied with a smirk. Think of this as the conclusion to your training, Verdant offered to Izuku with a smile that was neither warm nor comforting. You've been on excursion since the entrance exam. Show me what you've learned. Then she turned to Bakugo, and the smile became even more dangerous. And you, let's see if you've learned anything at all since the start of the year. You'll all have 30 minutes to complete the exam, Nezu explained. Your objective is to lock one of these pairs of handcuffs onto your adversary or escape from the combat zone entirely. This exam will be very similar to a real battle scenario, All Might continued. You must think of your teachers as real villains, or else you will be crushed. But in an ordinary situation, the experience gap would be too much to surmount. So we called on our support department to whip us up an equalizer in the form of ultra-compressed weights. You think we need a handicap in order to beat you? An offended Bakugo growled. Verdant only smirked and got right into Bakugo's face. Yeah, you do. Got a problem with that. Prove us wrong. The blonde practically snarled, but quickly paused and took a breath to calm himself. He sent a smoldering glare back at the retired pro. Damn right, I will. The tests will take place simultaneously, so here are each of your stages. Aizawa spoke up with a stack of papers for the 10 teams. The designated training grounds shouldn't be hard for you all to find, but for those of you with off-campus stages like the USJ, buses are already prepared. Don't waste time. With that informal dismissal, the paired students scrambled away towards their designated stages. Verdant shot the two a final look before walking away. "Don't keep me waiting," she called out to the two as she departed. Izuku and Bakugo stared after her retreating form, and they briefly shared a look before Bakugo huffed and walked away towards their exam stage. Izuku noted that the blonde looked like he wanted to say something, but he put it out of his mind for the coming exam. It certainly wasn't going to be as easy as he expected. Shoto, meanwhile, stared at the retreating duo of Izuku and Bakugo. He had only briefly seen Verdant in action at the USJ, and he figured that even with the destructive power both boys possessed, they probably had their work cut out for them. Stain showed them all that one doesn't necessarily need excessive firepower to be dangerous. He turned to his partner for the exam, Yayurazu, and he noticed that she looked rather uneasy. "Is something wrong?" Shoto seemingly surprised the girl with the question since she quickly shot up straight. "Oh, no, everything's fine," she shakily tried to assure, but even she doubted that she sounded very convincing. Shoto blankly observed the girl for a lengthy moment, and she began to lightly fidget under his two-tone scrutiny. Externally, he gave nothing away to her, but internally, he was carefully considering how to go about the situation he found himself in. Yayurazu was clearly unnerved about something regarding the exam. Ordinarily, he would elect not to think about it and focus on the task at hand. But he couldn't help but think about how Midoriya cut through his defenses to reach out to him for no other reason than because he wanted to help him, and he really needed help at that time. So, looking at the girl experiencing some sort of emotional turmoil, what would Midoriya do? It might be good to talk about whatever is troubling you so that it doesn't bog you down during the exam, he reasoned. We can talk on the way there. Yayurazu was taken aback at the proposal from the usually stoic and reserved teen. More than that, he raised a pretty valid point. "Oh, okay, sure." As the two began their trek, an awkward silence fell over them as Yayurazu worked up the nerve to say what was on her mind. Shoto stayed silent, struggling at winging his attempt to be helpful, but refusing to back down after already committing to the action. "Do I deserve to be here?" she finally spoke. "HM? Do I deserve to be here at UA in the hero program amongst so many other exceptionally talented people? People like you, Midoriya, or even Bakugo?" Shoto was initially silent as he considered what she said. He didn't quite understand what she was getting at. She was at the top of their class and had a powerful quirk, as well as the know-how to wield it efficiently and dangerously. Why wouldn't she consider herself to be among the people she named? Then again, she named Midoriya, and he would firmly place his new friend in the category of what Natsuo deemed bullshit personified, a designation for things that shouldn't exist or are too good to be true and just exist anyway in spite of all logic. All Might was the premier example to point to. As a rule of thumb, Midoriya probably isn't the best person to compare yourself to, Shoto responded, in anything. "But aren't you two practically rivals?" she questioned. "You're basically each other's equal in strength and skill, as well as foils to each other's quirks. Even the hero killer acknowledged you both." Shoto was about to comment on that, but she continued. "Meanwhile, I got in on a recommendation that I truly didn't even deserve just because my family had the connections, and I've done nothing of note outside of academics since then. I was useless in the sports festival once I was on my own, and Uwabami only selected me for an internship for my looks, not for my lacking ability. I've never been able to meet anyone's expectations for me, and I'm painfully mediocre at the one thing I've legitimately wanted to do in my life." The tears pricking at her eyes ramped up their attempts to escape. Maybe they were right all along. I should have just stuck to being the heiress instead of chasing a childish fancy. Once again, Shoto was silent. While he may not have agreed with her summation of herself, and he didn't know who they were, he was beginning to understand the situation he was dealing with. Again, he had absolutely no idea how to approach consoling someone, so he was left with one thought: WWMD? He tentatively reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder, and she looked at him through puffy eyes in confusion. "You're not alone," he assured. "You never are." Yaoyorozu sniffled, and Shoto felt a wave of déjà vu before pressing onward. "I know a bit about meeting insurmountable expectations. Our situations aren't exactly 1-1, but my old man wanted me to be something I wasn't meant to be, and I had to let go of basing my existence around him, even if it was based purely around spiting him." Yaoyorozu did not wake up that morning expecting to get a bit of insight into her classmate's backstory and his rocky relationship with his father, the No-2 hero, but she was certainly captivated by everything he was saying. "Now, I live and exist for myself and myself alone," Shoto continued. "I want to be a hero, and I'm going to do it my own way. I'll be the kind of hero I want to be, not what anyone else expects of me. You want to be a hero, too, and you're already well on your way, regardless of what anyone has to say or think about it." He mentally noted that they were approaching the exam stage before continuing. "You may not be as strong or have the raw power that Midoriya or I have, but you're far superior in other areas. You're smarter than I am, and you're probably a lot better at planning than I am, too." He paused again, and he racked his brain for anything else to say. Then something came to him. "You got 2 votes for class rep at the beginning of the semester, right? One of them was from me. I believed that you'd be good at the job, and I still do. I believe that you're a much better leader and hero than you give yourself credit for, and I believe that you'll lead our team to a decisive victory in this exam." The two stopped their trek, only partially because they had arrived at the exam location. Yaoyorozu was floored. Nothing could have prepared her for hearing something like that from her generally stoic classmate. The only person who spoke less than him was Koda, and the animal whisperer was functionally mute. To receive such heartfelt encouragement from him when she was practically at her lowest made her both want to cry and march into the exam with a fire she had never realized she possessed. It didn't hurt that the implication in his last remark was as clear as day. He was letting her take the reins and plan their strategy because he truly believed in her. Honestly, the way he spoke sounded a little alien coming from him. She knew that he meant it, but it would have felt much more fitting coming from. Oh. Well, that made much more sense to her. Midoriya was impacting lives without even being present. "Now, let's go past this exam," her partner encouraged with a nod. Yaoyorozu closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and steeled her newfound resolve. "Thank you, Todoroki. You're a good friend, a great friend. Let's pass this exam." The exam stage that Izuku and Bakugo found themselves in was a surprise to both. They didn't quite know what to expect when they were instructed to head underground, but a series of massive sewer tunnels wasn't on the list. The most spacious area was a dimly lit redwood forest of cement support beams that provided ample cover and shadows to skulk around in. "Where the hell does Yua get the money for this?" Izuku thought out loud. A low grunt from his partner for the exam drew his attention to him, and he took stock of Bakugo's pensive demeanor. "You've got something on your mind," Izuku stated to his partner. It wasn't a question, and Bakugo knew that. "Whatever beef you and Icy Hot had is settled," the ornery blonde snorted. "He got his rematch, but I never did. We're settling it after this exam." Izuku blinked, and then he shrugged. He could certainly understand the frustration a de facto victory in the sports festival would generate. He had no problem obliging his request. "So, got a plan in mind for this?" Izuku asked. "The hell do you think?" Bakugo scoffed. "We find Auntie and blow her up." The blank stare Bakugo received in response made him huff in frustration. "Yeah, I know, not that simple. And why the hell are you asking me? You're the nerd with plans for every situation. Besides, you should know a lot more about her skills and fighting style than me." Izuku cupped his hand around his chin and hummed. "Well, it's safe to say that she doesn't have the same firepower that we possess, so taking us both head-on wouldn't be wise. She'll likely stick to the shadows and employ hit-and-run tactics to wear us down before taking us out. All she really has to do is incapacitate us in the span of half an hour in order to win. We're the ones who need to defeat her or escape." "And there ain't no way we're running," Bakugo growled. "Right," Izuku shrugged. "The question becomes how we go about fighting her. Close quarters would be difficult." "That's one way of phrasing it," the blonde remarked while rubbing a phantom pain in his ribs. "And I can't go all out with my quirk with all the support beams around." Izuku blinked, and his head snapped up to gawk at Bakugo. "Do my ears deceive me? Is that character development? Jokes aside, we could use your explosions and my flames to light up the immediate area and expose her position when she slinks off. Now there's just the matter of what tricks she'll have up her sleeve that I don't know about." "You think she's holding out on you?" "I'm certain of it. Attention! All students have reached their testing areas. The practical exam will begin in 30 seconds. The voice of All Might bellowed through an intercom somewhere in the massive room. The two teens nodded to each other and stepped forward into the darker expanse of the room. "Begin." Izuku and Bakugo were not given any time to think before they were hit with a flashbang and smoke bomb combo to disorient them, and Bakugo was immediately met with a stiff kick to the jaw while his vision was obscured that sent him sprawling to the ground. Izuku engulfed his arm in green fire and swung it to blow the offending smoke away just in time to narrowly dodge a kick aimed right at his head. He brought his strengthened arm up to block the punch that followed, and he snatched her arm into his grasp and threw her over his shoulder towards a support beam. Verdant recovered from the throw and kicked off of the beam just before Izuku's fist impacted the structure and knocked a few large chunks of concrete off of it. "Irresponsible," she chided while extending her arm. Izuku, immediately realizing his error, ignited a bright yellow and ducked out of the path of the chunks of concrete that zoomed from behind him right through where he once stood. But he wasn't able to dodge the vicious punt to his chin that sent him to the ground with his partner. Said partner blasted himself back into the fray with a furious cry, and he unleashed a decent-sized explosion at the woman, but she was already gone. "Hell," Bakugo cursed. "She really isn't holding back," Izuku mused as he climbed to his feet. "No shit," Bakugo responded. "We can't let her control the pace. She can't take us both on at once, so let's find her and overwhelm her." Izuku nodded and his yellow flames intensified while Bakugo blasted into the air and zigzagged around the columns. The smaller explosions he was setting off illuminated the area enough to expose Verdant's hiding spot, and Izuku zoomed into action once they spotted her. He bounced from pillar to pillar toward her while Bakugo came down on her position from above. Verdant shot them both an unsettling grin that practically beckoned them to attack, and attack they did. Izuku was first, launching himself at her with a yellow fist to her guarded abdomen. Verdant grabbed him and used some of his momentum to pivot and toss him into the air toward the approaching Bakugo. The explosive blonde snarled and snatched him with his left hand without missing a beat, and he unleashed a powerful explosion at the ground she was standing on, creating even more rubble. As expected, she dodged the blast, but she was very quickly met with the form of her son flying at her courtesy of Bakugo. Izuku and Verdant met in combat once again, this time launching into a heated exchange of blows that the woman was swiftly getting the better of. Having taught the boy just about everything she could, she was easily able to read his movements and counter his attacks because they were so familiar to her. The ease in which she was keeping him at bay was almost disappointing to her until a fist wreathed in green fire seemingly cut through the air next to her face, slicing through some of her hair in the process. Then, all she saw was her son's smirk before Bakugo practically materialized from the darkness and propelled himself around a pillar to hit her in the back with an explosion that both sent her flying and knocked the wind out of her. Quickly recovering, she instinctively grasped the discarded rubble from the explosion with her quirk and pulled it towards her with the two teens in the line of fire. They had seemingly been expecting that, as a wall of orange formed behind them to block the rubble, and Bakugo launched for her unimpeded with more explosions at the ready. It became clear to her as the blonde peppered her with his quirk that the two had deliberately led her into a trap, with her son acting as a distraction and support while Bakugo unleashed hellfire on her. She was genuinely proud of the two for the quick thinking, and she'd definitely make them a big meal after it was all said and done. However, it was not all said and done just yet. It was about time that she introduced the two heroes in training to the silent, green assassin. As Bakugo was bombarding her with small explosions to wear her down, she reached to her utility belt and grabbed a large capsule of powdered sugar that she prepared specifically for the battle. She whipped the powdery substance between herself and her attacker, and she stuck her left hand out, practically strafing out of the line of fire of the much larger explosion than Bakugo intended to release due to the ignition of the sugar, the backfire of which sent him sprawling back to the ground with light burns on his upper body. Her open palm landed on the nearest pillar, but her focus shifted when that arm was then ensnared in a collection of violet ropes courtesy of her son, followed by her waist and midsection becoming tightly coiled with even more of the ropes. She turned to see her son readying a green flame-enhanced haymaker while he had her locked within his clutches. With a simple flick of her wrist, the teen stopped dead in his tracks with a gasp and crumpled to the floor like a severed marionette. "The F?" Bakugo questioned before a flick of her other wrist sent a wave of pain through his ribs, sending him crashing to the ground as well. The two boys writhed in blinding pain on the cold concrete, struggling with all their might to figure out what the hell was going on. All the while, the retired pro hero stood over them with an appraising smile that just bordered on sadistic. "Funny thing about my quirk is that it isn't just a derivative of basic telekinesis," she began with a much bubblier tone than anyone should have in her situation. "I can attract anything that could feasibly fit in my hand, and that includes tugging at your bones and internal organs. I wonder how you'll get out of this jam." "I wasn't aware that her quirk could do that," a deflated Toshinori said in mild horror as he watched the screens showcasing the concurrent exams beside Recovery Girl. His hand unconsciously traveled to his scarred side with a grimace. "To manipulate someone's internals like that, she needs some way to incapacitate people with strong mutations and super-powered oafs like you," Recovery Girl answered. "Quirks can do a lot to make your body as solid as can be, especially externally. Most people can't do much for their internal organ, though. You can't just make them rock solid. It's an easy thing to exploit when you need an edge against an opponent that outclasses you physically." Toshinori hummed in acceptance, though it didn't make him feel any less queasy about it. Recovery Girl, meanwhile, watched the screen with a bit of worry for her friend. They had gotten to know each other a good bit since she started working at UA, and the old medic learned a little bit about why the mother retired in the first place. It wasn't pretty, and she just hoped that the woman didn't lose herself in the battle, especially with her own son involved. Verdant watched the two boys squirm in front of her as they tried their hardest to soldier through the excruciating pain and make it back to their feet, but each time they made a push, they were unceremoniously brought back to the unforgiving floor. The pain was otherworldly, and it only grew as the seconds ticked on. It truly felt as though several of their bones, muscles, and internal organs were practically fighting to shoot out of their body. "It's a strange feeling to have your life literally rest in someone's grasp, isn't it?" Verdant spoke to the two, not that they were really listening very hard with the torment they were enduring. That feeling of hopelessness when the situation looks so completely bleak, when you feel that there's absolutely nothing you can do to survive. Rock bottom is either a grave or a turning point. Are you a survivor, or is this the end of your road? Now, Izuku was listening. He got the gist of what his mother was saying, and it dawned on him that their current situation was quite literally another test within the test. She was testing their mental fortitude to soldier on at their lowest, literally against all odds. He craned his neck over to Bakugo, and he was met with a shaky yet determined nod. The two had a conversation with only their eyes, and they were in agreement on a plan. Izuku fought through his mother's quirk and reached into his costume for the handcuffs, and he brandished them with a weak grip once he got a hold of them. In a flash, though, the handcuffs were swiped out of his grasp and into Verdant's awaiting hand. "I don't think so," she practically cooed with malice, and it started to unnerve the two teens. Bakugo stared up at his pseudo-aunt before them, and he noticed that her eyes became a little vacant, a 1,000-yard stare occupying its place before the pain ramped up even more, and he curled in on himself with a howl. "How does it feel, Musha?" she began in a strangely dead tone. "To be the one with your life in my hands? To be at my mercy? To be certain that you'll die a horrible death, alone and forgotten?" She knelt down and leaned closer to Bakugo, her usually weary, emerald eyes now dull and unfocused. "Do you feel what I felt now?" Before Bakugo could gasp and Verdant could utter another word, she was kicked in the side of the head by a newly mobile Izuku who snatched the handcuffs from her grasp. While she was temporarily disoriented, he quickly latched them onto her wrist and connected her to himself, ending the exam right then. A buzzer sounded once the cuffs were applied, and All Might's voice bellowed over the hidden intercom once more. "Midoriya and Bakugo have passed their exam." Izuku would have been able to pick up on how strained All Might's voice was in that announcement had he been paying any attention whatsoever. But his focus was instead on his mother, who was sloppily trying to compose herself. Needless to say, he was highly unsettled by what he had witnessed and heard from his mother. More than that, though, he was livid. It didn't take a genius to surmise that his mother wasn't seeing Bakugo in those last few moments, rather someone else who had apparently left her for dead in the past. The utterance of Musha narrowed it down to who that could have been, and Izuku could feel the blackness that he had been trying to run away from spark back up with a fiery vengeance. If his suspicions were correct, he was going to kill a top 10 hero. I'm so sorry," the hushed whisper from his mother shook him out of his rage, and he laid eyes on the quivering form of the woman who raised him. She was staring down at her hands in utter horror, and tears were practically pouring down her cheeks. "I'm so sorry." Without a moment's hesitation, Izuku wrapped himself around his mother and nestled her into himself with his free arm, and she practically melted into her son's comfort as she broke. It's okay," Izuku assured. "You're here, and you're safe. You're alive, and you have me. You'll always have me." While Inko slowly composed herself from within the comfort of her son's hold, Izuku met eyes with Bakugo. The blonde's typically angry gaze was nowhere to be found, and all that remained was a look of genuine concern. As if silently asking for permission, Bakugo ignored the residual pain from her last attack and tentatively reached for the woman he saw as an aunt. Izuku nodded, and Bakugo placed a gloved hand on her shoulder, bringing her out of her quiet sobs and focusing her attention onto the son of her best friend. Then she looked up at her own son, sporting a mixture of concern and distress that was far too aged for her liking. She took the deepest breath she could muster, and she offered the two boys a grateful, watery smile. "I'm okay. Thank you both." "You sure?" Bakugo asked with a raised eyebrow. "Yes, I'm sure," she replied, and she brought her son into the biggest hug that being handcuffed to him would allow. "I love you so much, Izu." "I love you too, Mom," Izuku lowly responded to hide the emotion in his voice from Bakugo, but it was unsuccessful. That didn't matter, though, as Inko looked to the blonde and motioned for him to join the hug. He begrudgingly did so. "And I love you, too, Katsuki," the mother said warmly. "Whatever, likewise, Auntie," Bakugo grumbled. When the trio broke the group hug, she fixed the two with a proud, beaming smile. "You boys were absolutely stellar. I am so unbelievably proud of how far you both have come." At points, it felt like you were practically strafing around to avoid hits, Izuku commented as they walked through the massive tunnel towards a smaller tunnel that presumably led to the exit. I knew you were really agile and quick on your feet, but that was ridiculous. It's part of my quirk, she explained with a giggle, much to the surprise of both teens. Attraction of small objects works twofold. I can attract small things, and I can also attract myself to larger things. In the second instance, I am the small object. How the hell does that work? Bakugo questioned. It's partially that my quirk was mislabeled when I was a child. Back then, I could attract pencils, dolls, and other things, and we all just kind of thought that was the extent of it. When I started training to be a pro, I experimented with the limits of my quirk and discovered a few other aspects to it. With objects that are too big for me to attract, I can sort of flip a switch and send myself toward them instead. I do it in battle by attracting myself to walls or the floor to give myself a non-negligible boost in speed and mobility. So, that's why you're always so hard to hit, Izuku grumbled while scribbling away in his notebook that Bakugo had half a mind to destroy for popping out of literally nowhere. Yep, she cheerily confirmed as they exited the larger tunnel and strolled closer to the exit of the exam stage entirely. None of the three mentioned the hiccup at the end of the match. The two boys were left with several thoughts whizzing about their minds, but each boy had one thought present itself to the forefront ahead of all the others. For one of them, it was added confirmation that Inko was a truly terrifying individual and a kernel of information about a pro that he'd have to look into. For the other, it was a bit of a wake-up call. He never wanted to force his mother to talk about anything, but he felt that he'd eventually have to. Toshinori and Recovery Girl watched the screens in silence. What was that all about? Toshinori asked in concern, and he could even feel one for all buzzing within. Recovery Girl sighed. She has some unresolved baggage from her time as an active pro. I don't know the full story, and I can't make her talk to anyone, but maybe her son will have some luck. Toshinori turned back to the screen with a frown. Luckily, Midoriya and Bakugo were one of the first teams to finish, so he could ease his mind with the rest of the students' exams. Tamura slumped into his seat in one of the booths of the bar with a glass of whiskey in hand. A short huff escaped him before he downed his drink in one go. It had been a few weeks since the release of the Stain video, and the recruitment effort for the league had been slow going. The bulk of the interested parties were either low-level weaklings looking to move up in the criminal underworld or unstable psychopaths just out to murder indiscriminately. The second category wouldn't have bothered him much before, but he constantly found himself thinking back to the things Stain had said to him. Sensei didn't like him questioning who he was or what he even wanted to accomplish, but Tamura was nearing a point where he didn't care how Sensei felt. Sensei wouldn't even tell him why Player 2 was so important to the man beyond his belief that he was connected to All Might, as dubious as that connection felt to Tamura. He hated not being in the loop, and he especially hated being underestimated and talked down to. On the subject of All Might, the symbol of peace was becoming muddied in his mind as well. He wanted to destroy All Might because he loathed everything the man represented for their broken society. That much he felt in his bones. However, did he actually hate All Might as a person as well, or was Sensei just projecting his own personal disdain for All Might onto him? And that just tied back to the crux of the issue. Who even was he? Was Tamura Shigaraki even a real person? Was he just a puppet for his sensei, a successor when it was convenient, and a pissy child when it wasn't? Going even further, what did he even want to do with society after tearing it down? Did he want to build a better one in its place, or did he just want to play in the ashes? His inner struggles had bled into his selections for recruits. Even when parsing through the decent candidates, he wasn't satisfied with the motivations he came across. The best recruit Jurin had been able to bring them thus far was some whiny brat with an axe to grind against Yua, and he was only memorable because he had a rather useful quirk. "Shiggy, how's it going?" came the smooth call of the league's info broker as he entered the bar. Call me that again, and I'll make a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle out of you, Tamura growled. Jiren's smile widened, putting the gap in his teeth on full display. Aw, don't be like that. You know you love me too much to kill me. I'm also much too valuable to get rid of. Why the hell are you here? Tamura begged the man to get to the point. I come bearing gifts, he started before beckoning in 3 new arrivals. I know you've been iffy on the last few batches, but I'm feeling good about these 3. In stepped a unique collection of individuals. One was a tall, slender man who looked a little older than Tamura. His red hair somewhat hung over his eyes, but he could see the boredom in his gaze that complemented his slouch. They were already starting off on the wrong foot if one of them looked like he wished he was literally anywhere else but there. The second one was an equally tall, slender man covered in a myriad of burns and staples with a bored yet piercing turquoise gaze to round it out. So, it's really you, the second arrival spoke. I saw a picture of you, but you look gross in person. You're one to talk, patchwork, Tamura shot back before assessing the final arrival. She was a short, teenage girl with an unsettling smile and what looked like a knife hidden in her sleeve. He'd have to help her hide those better in the future. It's the hand guy, the girl excitedly cheered. You're friends with Mr. Staney, right? Please, let me join the league. Tamura's eye twitched, but he kept a lid on his emotions. Who are you, and why do you want to join the league? The girl's bright smile dimmed, and her eyes minutely started to sag as if a lifetime of exhaustion had just caught up with her in that moment. Tamura could relate. Because existence is pain when it doesn't have to be, the girl bluntly stated before her smile returned and the mania in her eyes was back. Himiko Toga, the world is a hard place to live in, and I want to make it better. Tamura was mildly taken aback by the mood whiplash, but he supposed that he could empathize with that desire, which was news to him because he wasn't even aware that he had the capacity for empathy. What about him? Tamura pointed to the burned man. Unlike her, this guy doesn't have a serious rap sheet as of yet, but he holds true to the hero killer's ideology, Jiren supplied. More or less, the man shrugged. Society is fundamentally broken, and someone has to step up to do something about it. Since Stain is out for the count, might as well be me. And your name? Tamura groused. I go by Dabai, was his simple reply. Real MO, Tamura muttered before turning to the last arrival. And you? Names are power. Call me Kusari, he flippantly answered. And why are you here? Tamura gritted out. The too edgy for-me SH tick from the 2 men was really starting to grate on him. The redhead raised his head at the question and locked eyes with Tamura through the villain's mask. Something seemed to change within the man, and that put Tamura on edge. This superhuman society has been forced into a bronze straitjacket by needless and discriminatory regulation of our very birthrights. Burn it down and start anew where people can wield their natural abilities as they please. Everyone, even Kurogiri, stopped and stared at the man. Jiren wasn't super knowledgeable about him, which made the broker nervous, and he only brought the redhead with him because he could sense the predator under the calm facade and figured that Tamura would enjoy having a reliable mercenary. Toga and Dabai gave him long looks, one curious and one calculating. The smoky barman considered him carefully before looking to Tamura. The man's answer felt adjacent to popular rhetoric he had encountered before, and he wondered if Sensei was listening. All for One was indeed listening, and if he had eyes, they would have been narrowed at Kusari's declaration. It appeared that Distro's NTH times removed brat was trying to make a play. He could only smile at the development. Things really were becoming so amusing. Then, without another word, Kusari slid his hands into his pockets and resumed his slouch before looking to Kurogiri. Got any Yamazaki? Kurogiri nodded and retrieved a bottle of the requested whiskey as well as a freshly cleaned glass. Tamura silently watched the man meander to a stool at the bar and sit down with his drink as if nothing had happened. Yeah, that man was dangerous. More than that, he had conviction. All three of them seemed to have it in their own special ways. Conviction and an identity. They all had it. Hell, even Spinner and Kurogiri had it. It was what the League needed. It was what he needed. Tamura could not sit still. The recruitment effort had been an undeniable success with the introduction of Toga, Dabai, and Kuzari into the fold. With those three, himself, Kurogiri, and Spinner, they were already at 6. A few more heavies and a Namu to round out the party were all they needed before taking any action, and Tamura would admit to being excited at the prospect. With that said, excitement wasn't all he was feeling. The young man had an itch that begged to be scratched, one that his sensei wouldn't help with. In fact, his sensei would rather him scratch the itch by reducing it to bloody dust. The cause of Tamura's itch was Player 2, otherwise known as Izuku Midoriya. There had to have been a reason for Sensei's fixation on the boy alongside All Might, and Tamura was fed up with being kept in the dark. If Sensei wouldn't tell him, then he'd have to figure it out himself, and he was prepared to flip the world on its ass to get the answer. Luckily, Sensei was out taking care of an important errand, and Tamura knew just the person to help him with his task. It was time for some networking. That led him to his current station at his computer. He contacted an acquaintance that he met on an old gaming forum years prior when the forum hadn't yet been taken over by 66 Deniers and the CRC. He only knew her by her screen name, Piroflov, but he had gotten to know the clingy poster enough to learn that she was a very capable hacker. When he sent her a name alongside a picture of a bloody, freckled teen with fluffy, green hair from the UA Sports Festival, finding his quirk registration and family tree was child's play for her. Why she already had backdoors into the networks of several government agencies, he didn't know, and he felt that it wasn't his business anyway. He thought about extending her an invitation to the League, but she was apparently preoccupied with some weirdo vlogger she had an obsession with. Expecting them to be a package deal should he extend any invites, he held off for the moment and decided to keep it to being business partners. Having a hacker on retainer would be pretty useful down the line, even if she wouldn't be an official member of the League. Parsing through the records she sent him was the next step. The first thing he noticed was a note that the HPSC attached to his quirk registration labeling the teen as a mid-level priority to be monitored. That definitely surprised him. It seemed a little excessive for just being a kid that Stain respected. Maybe there was more going on there. Opting to make a mental note of that and move right along, he looked through the boy's family tree and found that his only living relative was his mother, Izuku Midoriya, whose maiden name was Akatani via adoption. Said Akatani parents died of natural causes, but beyond having been decently wealthy, they were not very remarkable otherwise. They certainly weren't remarkable enough to be on Sensei's radar, and he hadn't remembered the man ever mentioning anyone of that name. That meant that unless the connection came from the father's side, Tamura had to look a little deeper into Izuku Midoriya. Luckily, Piroflov was very thorough with her search, and she dug up the woman's adoption records, as well as any other pertinent information from the foster home the woman was at. As it happened, her true maiden name was Shimura. Tamura wasn't exactly sure why the name bothered him as much as it did. Wasn't that the name of All Might's old mentor that Sensei killed? Nana Shimura, or something like that. That would explain why the surname was familiar to him, but it didn't explain why the name resonated with him so deeply. Deciding to look a little further into the records he was sent, he discovered that she wasn't there alone. She had an older brother named... What the... Tamura's breath hitched, and his hands instinctively traveled to his neck at the picture of the young boy on the screen beside the name Kotaro Shimura. He was struck by a sudden wave of anxiety and fear, and he couldn't rip his eyes away from the pictured boy's own eyes. He had no earthly idea why he felt that way until a stabbing pain shot through his head, and he was inundated with bleary flashes of days long forgotten. The one consolation for those who failed the practical portion of their final exams would be the I-Expo set to take place just before training camp, provided they received invitations to go. Unfortunately, Ashido, Kaminari, Sato, Kirishima, and Siro did not receive invitations to go, so they were effectively shit out of luck on both fronts. It was a logical ruse. You're all attending training camp. Well, perhaps not. Aizawa flared his quirk to quiet down the predictable storm of chatter that his announcement brewed. Fortunately, you all passed the written tests, and failing those was the only way you would have been barred from training camp. Unfortunately, for the 2 teams who didn't pass and the 1 student that was incapacitated while your partner escaped, you'll be receiving supplementary education during what would normally be your downtime between your regular training sessions at camp. The mentioned students completely deflated at that, but they took solace in the fact that they at least still got to go. Now, as some of you may be aware, the I-Expo at I-Island is happening very soon, and Principal Nezu was made aware that the winner of the UA Sports Festival was extended an invitation. Several eyes in class widened, and Bakugo looked to be a mixture of intrigued and annoyed. As such, training camp will be held immediately after the I-Expo, so you'll all have at least a week to prepare as best as you can, Aizawa continued. Bakugo, if you plan on going, be on your best behavior. Not only are you representing UA, but you're representing yourself as a future pro hero. Do not act out of character just because you're in a new and unfamiliar environment. Bakugo grunted in response, not really seeing why he was hammering in the point so hard. The hell was so special about I-Island, anyway? It was just a bunch of eggheads on a floating city. What trouble was there to cause? I don't believe I heard you, Aizawa followed up with narrowed eyes that were glowing red. Yes, sir, Bakugo finally relented. Good, the teacher nodded. That goes for any of you that find yourself attending. Don't find any trouble, don't make any trouble, and don't hurt yourself too badly before training camp. You're free to do whatever before your first class begins. At the dismissal, the class broke into their own pockets of conversation until Aizawa spoke up once again. Oh, one last thing. Midoriya, Ida, Principal Nezu wants to see you too during lunch, he said before turning away once again and leaving the room with his sleeping bag in hand. With that, the class resumed their chatter. Izuku was left wondering what his mentor could want with him and Ida, but he assumed it had to do with the I-Expo. Had it anything to do with Stain, Shoto surely would have been called as well. Whatever it may have been, he welcomed the distraction. He hadn't been able to think about anything other than his mother's episode during the practical exam. Someone hurt his mother, and he would kill them. No. He couldn't do that. He wouldn't do that. That was the blackness speaking. He was not a killer. He was a hero. Hey, nerd, you're heating up. Izuku was so thankful for Bakugo's interruption, and he was even more thankful that the blonde had the presence of mind to speak in a hushed tone, though it likely didn't escape the notice of Gyro and Shoji. He'd deal with that another time. Thanks, he muttered with a sigh. She tell you anything? No. She avoided the subject completely after you left the apartment, and I didn't know how to push the issue. That was another thing. His mother insisted that Bakugo have dinner with them so that she could cook them a celebratory meal, and he obliged, but there was clearly an elephant in the room the entire evening that the 3 did their very best to ignore. After Bakugo left, Izuku wanted to broach the subject to his mother, but he didn't know how, and she didn't seem inclined to bring it up herself despite the somewhat awkward tension in the apartment. He was just glad that the exams all happened simultaneously, so none of his classmates aside from Bakugo were aware that it even happened, and it would stay that way for as long as he lived. He was grateful for the new distraction that came along in the form of Ochako's encroaching hand, which he aptly dodged and grasped. You got me once already, and it will not happen again. We'll see about that, the brunette giggled. How did your practical go? I doubt your mom went easy on you too. No, she certainly didn't, he answered with a rub of his kidney. She treated it as my final assessment from her training. I am officially a graduate of the Midoriya Hellspawn Academy. Izuku took great pleasure in the simultaneous "stop trying to make that a thing" and "the kind of name is that?" from his fellow Academy students. Well, now former fellow Academy students. Tamura shook in a crouch amongst the destruction in his room. Everything, save for his computer, was reduced to dust or smashed in some way. His fingernails were stained with blood from the scratches on his neck, and his beady, red eyes were wide and unfocused. "Mother, Hana." The image of his father's snarl before striking him flashed once more, and it was followed by the man's horror upon seeing Tamura's quirk activation. The image of the young Kotaro overlaid atop adult Kotaro's panic as he wielded the weed clipper. "I remember." Tamura dry heaved. He remembered his family. He remembered the picture of his grandmother. He remembered his father's hatred. He remembered the itching. He remembered desperately reaching out for his sister and mother for help. He remembered his mother still trying to comfort him as she decayed into chunks. He remembered killing his father and enjoying every second of it because in that brief moment, the itching finally stopped. He remembered everything. Cousin. He had a cousin. He had a living cousin and a living aunt. His cousin wanted to be a hero. Heroes were scum and deserved to die with everything else. Was his cousin the same? Sensei was still out handling that errand. Tamura would find the boy himself. When Izuku and Ida approached Nezu's office during lunch, Izuku stepped aside and allowed his friend to knock. Not thinking anything of it, Ida reached for the door, but it swung open before his hand could make contact, and they were met with the smiling visage of their animal principal. Izuku had to stifle his laughter at the surprised sputtering from his friend. "Excellent, you're right on time," the principal chirped. "Please, come in and have a seat." The two students did so, and the Chimera sat behind his desk and offered the two boys tea that Ida knew for certain didn't exist prior to him sitting down. He turned his confused gaze to the other student with him, but he was just calmly sipping the offered beverage as if nothing was amiss. "I'm certain you're both wondering why I requested the two of you to see me," Nezu began, and they nodded. "It's regarding the upcoming I-Expo." "I had a feeling," Izuku commented after another sip of his tea. He had to give it to the rodent marsupial ursine. The blend in his hands was fantastic. "What about the I-Expo, sir?" Ida questioned. "I'd be remiss if I didn't inform you that I didn't receive an invitation to attend." "Not officially," the principal amended the boy's statement, much to Ida's surprise. "Your brother has been invited on the basis of receiving an experimental treatment to heal his condition, and you have the option of attending as his +1. Ida practically gawked at the information. "But Midoriya already healed him, right? He can move just fine again. He beat both of us in a race, quite handily, I might add." "You don't have to bring that up," Izuku muttered with a pout. "Indeed, but the details of his healing were never released to the public," Principal Nezu responded. "The fact that he was healed at all was never released to the public. In fact, there's a reason he hasn't returned to active duty yet despite being perfectly healthy. I had just assumed he wanted to spend time with us before heading back into danger," Ida commented somewhat downcast. "That's probably the biggest part of it," Izuku interjected, not wanting his friend to take the situation negatively. "But if I'm reading between the lines correctly, you and Ingenium kept the whole procedure under wraps to keep my role in his recovery a secret." The Chimera nodded with a smile, glad that his student was able to determine that on his own. It would make the following discussion after Ida was to be dismissed much less taxing. "Why keep that a secret, if you don't mind me asking?" Ida questioned with a raised eyebrow. "Don't you want the credit for such a great feat, Midoriya?" Nezu chose to answer the boy's question in place of Izuku. "Healing quirks in general are rare, and quirks that can repair damage on that level are even rarer. A quirk like that would be a hot commodity on its own, but combined with all of the other facets of young Izuku's quirk, it would be much safer for him to stay out of the spotlight." Experimental treatment at I-Island is believable enough to not raise much of a fuss since such procedures do already exist at an extremely exorbitant cost. Ida nodded at that explanation, and Izuku sipped his tea in acceptance. He idly wondered if there was more to it than what the principal was saying. He wouldn't put it past the Chimera. Now, then, am I correct to assume that you will be attending alongside your brother for the procedure? Nezu asked Ida. Do not worry about the situation seeming underhanded. It has already been squared away with all parties on I-Island. Yes, I shall certainly attend. Ida was practically vibrating with excitement. Thank you so much, sir. Excellent. You are dismissed. Stay behind, young Izuku, Nezu instructed, and the taller boy gratefully bowed before leaving. How did you manage to set that little ruse up on I-Island of all places? Izuku questioned with a smirk. Nothing too taxing, just a little bit of blackmail, Nezu waved off. Would I also be correct to assume that All Might extended you an invitation as well? Yes, he confirmed. He has 2+1 invites, though. I was going to ask my mom, but she hates flying, so I'm not expecting a yes from her. It wouldn't be the best time for her to be traveling. Anyway, Nezu nodded, causing Izuku's brow to furrow. Yes, I'm well aware of what happened during your practical exam. You did a splendid job with helping calm her down. Izuku hesitantly nodded, and the principal continued. I will need her here on campus for an important meeting while you'll be on I-Island, and it concerns why I asked for you to stay behind. I had an inkling that the explanation you gave Ida wasn't your only reason. Things are never that simple with you, Izuku commented, and the principal nodded. Indeed. Keeping the specifics of your quirk out of public knowledge is only part of it. There are undoubtedly people who would come for you if they knew about that aspect of your quirk, though I'm confident that you could handle yourself just fine against most of them. Most? Izuku questioned. We'll circle back to that, Nezu responded before taking a sip of his tea. The real party we are keeping it from is the HPSC. Izuku furrowed his brow and put his cup down. He knew that the commission wasn't particularly ecstatic about the Stain video, and he was already giving the bare minimum on his quirk registration to keep their eyes away from him at his mother's request. They've begun sniffing, Nezu continued. The commission taking a closer interest in you and young Todoroki will only make your lives much more difficult. This trip to I-Island and the following training camp gets you away for a bit while also throwing the scent off your trail. Meanwhile, I will be making preparations for the road to come. What exactly does that entail? Izuku hesitantly questioned, and the Chimera gave him a chilling smile. If all goes well, a very difficult road ahead for the HPSC's continued existence, he answered cryptically. Izuku sighed with a chuckle. Sometimes I feel like you're always prepping for war. Like the entrance exam is just an excuse to manufacture an army of giant deathbots. And the stage for my final exam was just one part of a massive network of tunnels under the building in case of an invasion. Izuku looked up at his principal to laugh along with him at the comical thought, but Nezu's smile did not falter for a second. He merely continued smiling and gazing at the teen, and Izuku slowly began to pale. Right, Izuku coughed into his hand and nervously tried to move on to another subject. You said that I'd be able to handle most people who came after my healing abilities. Why only most? I'm certain you've heard of the quirk thief, Nezu answered, his smile disappearing. He's pretty much an urban legend, Izuku responded with his face set into the same frown that Nezu's was. Are you saying that he's real? He was the one responsible for All Might's current condition, Nezu answered, and any blood that hadn't left Izuku's face when he accidentally stumbled on Nezu's war plans made a swift exit. Then Izuku stammered, and his eyes slowly traveled down to the desk. But he wasn't really seeing anything in particular. He killed Grandma Nana. He tore my mother's family apart. Izuku's eyes hardened, and Nezu didn't miss the brief spark of black in the boy's green pupils. What happened to him? Nezu did not respond immediately, instead taking a sip of his tea. Izuku knew what that meant, but he waited for the creature's reply, nonetheless. We have our suspicions that he may be the puppet master behind the League of Villains, Nezu answered. Izuku's face set into a scowl. Can All Might put him down for good? For all of our sakes, I sincerely hope so. The rest of the day proceeded on as normal. His classmates all decided that they'd go to the mall together that weekend to shop for all the stuff they needed to prepare for a week out in the forest. With the exceptions of Shoto, who visited his mom on his off days, and Bakugo, who decided to do literally anything else. Izuku agreed to tag along since he needed to get a suit for the I-Expo anyway, and he was struck with an idea at the thought of the event. At the end of the day, he directly went to the development studio. To his surprise, the person he was looking for was being wheeled out of the lab in a restraint chair right as he got there. Come on, just 15 minutes, Mei whined from the chair that wouldn't budge no matter how hard she fought. No, Hatsune, Power Loader sighed. If I let you in there, you will spend the entirety of your summer break in the lab. Go home. You can't hinder ingenuity, she shouted before noticing Izuku. Oh, Muscles, are you here to make some more babies? Power Loader rubbed his temples at the speed in which she leaped into conversation with a client as if she wasn't completely restrained. Not this time, he chuckled. I actually came to ask if you were busy next week. Mei would have placed her hand on her chin had the appendage not been firmly secured to the chair. Well, Power Loader forbade me from spending summer break in the lab, so I don't have any plans to my knowledge. Why? I got an invite to the I-Expo as a +1, and I wanted to know if you wanted the other spot, Izuku answered, and he had to dodge the stars that shot out of her eyes. He certainly wasn't prepared for her to burst out of the restraint chair and damn near tackle him. The I-Expo? On I-Island? Absolutely, she shouted while practically bouncing around him. Meanwhile, Power Loader's eyes were glued to the remains of the restraint chair, and he was racking the furthest corners of his brain to figure out just how the short, teenage girl with an ocular quirk tore through a chair that was meant to be able to securely hold even Hound Dog in place. Awesome. Let's go find Mr. Yagi. He's the one with the tickets, Izuku excitedly declared, and the two scampered away from the dumbstruck teacher. After a few silent minutes, he gave up and shook his head. He was about to head back into the lab until it occurred to him just what the boy had asked her, and he became as pale as a sheet of paper. Hatsune at I-Island, he shouted. The two teens, meanwhile, were bounding through the hallways on a hunt for a skinny blonde that smelled like blood. Mei had never met the man before, so she was relying on Izuku to find him. As luck would have it, they encountered the man in question just as he was exiting one of the offices. Mr. Yagi, just the man I was looking for, Izuku spoke with an attempt at a disarming smile. It was not effective, as Toshinori was immediately on guard. He could already feel in his gut that he wanted nothing to do with the chaos that the next few decisions would inevitably cause the world in the future. Young Midoriya, he hazarded, what can I do for you? I've got our other +1 for the expo, Izuku answered while motioning to the support course student beside him. While this was happening, Mei was carefully examining the tall, blonde man. She had never seen him before, yet something about him was profoundly familiar. Her memory when it came to names, faces, and most things not involving technology was admittedly not great, but something about the man staring quizzically at her rang way too many bells for her to ignore. She zoomed in on his face to get a better look at him. Toshinori, on the other hand, was a little uncomfortable with the prolonged silence. He recognized the girl from the sports festival. It was hard to forget someone who hijacked a match to showcase her support equipment for 10 uninterrupted minutes. He would grant her that she was a very capable inventor, and he could certainly see why the young man would extend the invite to her, but All Might? Mei finally broke the silence. Any teachers and students still milling about the building would not be blamed for thinking that Vlad King had unleashed his quirk with the amount of blood Toshinori hacked up. The Aoyama family was a proud one. the trio of French immigrants could boast a comfortable wealth and decent social standing, and it was only strengthened by the glamour of the family's scion, Yuga, attending the most prestigious hero school in the nation, Ua High School. Not only was their son on path to graduate from one of the premier hero institutions on the planet, but he would also go on to become the most magnifique pro-hero to ever grace the shores of the land of the rising sun. It was his destiny. There was just one little hiccup to their picturesque image, though. It came in the form of a towering man in a black suit and frightening mask with a presence about him that would make the devil himself sweat. You see, their son, Yuga, was not born with a quirk. If being a foreigner didn't already make him different enough, being a quirkless foreigner was essentially putting him into a natural isolation chamber. Fitting in was never going to be an option for him, no matter how well off he was, and his parents were very worried about what would become of their son's mental health as he grew older. That led them to a decision that they would very quickly end up regretting, and they'd do so for the rest of their lives. A perverse mixture of love and desperation led them to make a deal with the devil. Not since the infamous English villain of old, Murder Boner, who brutally slaughtered the famous paragon of justice, Napoleon Bonaparte, in single combat did one man incur so much fear in the hearts of the Aoyama parents. The facade of granting their boy a quirk with no strings attached was shattered into thousands of jagged pieces and mixed into their dinner when he returned to collect on the debt. And they had no choice but to swallow the tainted meal without complaint, since the alternative was death. Yuga was to be all-for-one spy in Ua after hearing whispers of All Might being set to become a teacher at the school. He was to provide all-for-one's agents with information about his classmates and their activities. He was to expose exploitable security risks to them. He was to loyally serve All for One and assist the League of Villains in bringing about the death of the symbol of peace, or else his family would be slaughtered. That led them to the current situation at the Aoyama home. Two loving parents were tightly clutching their petrified son while keeping him behind them at all times, valiantly trying to protect their progeny despite them shaking in fear themselves. It would have been heartwarming to the centuries-old supervillain if it weren't so hilarious. They could put the entire population of Hong Kong between himself and their son, and it still wouldn't save him when it was time to collect. However, now wasn't the time for amusement. All for One was there on important business. The pathetic family had served him very well to that point, but the situation was transforming into something he wasn't a fan of. Tomoro was beginning to question him and his goals, and while he could certainly kidnap the young man and forcefully pull his loyalties back onto the correct path through reconditioning, he did not wish to resort to that just yet. His chosen successor was not yet lost, but he did want to prepare for such an eventuality if it were to come to pass. Thus, here he was in the Aoyama home placing a few contingencies on the parents and sufficiently acquainting himself with the young boy to ensure that he would never escape warping if when it was time to put Plan B into action. "So, I heard from the grapevine that you all have a training camp coming up," he said with a chilling smile. The symbol of evil's voice felt like acid in the ears of the family, but Yuga could do little more than shakily nod. All for One's smile grew not that they could see it, and the Aoyama family felt any hope they might have had before that day vanish into the wind. "Tell me more." The class excursion to the mall the next day was supposed to help keep Izuku's brain busy so that he didn't obsess over his mother. It wasn't working by any stretch. Not even the mysterious absence of Aoyama from the group was enough to keep his mind occupied. After everyone agreed to split up and meet back up later, Izuku got everything he needed within a few minutes and offered to get some food while Ochako kept shopping, partially just to be alone with his thoughts to keep her from worrying about him. He knew that he needed to sit down and ask her about it straight up, and he resolved to do that when he returned home from the mall. However, there was also the issue of his mounting rage surrounding what little he gleaned from the situation. She mentioned someone named Musha in her haze, and while he didn't want to jump to conclusions, the only Musha he knew of was Yoroi Musha, the current No. 10 pro hero. He knew why she hated Endeavor since she told him the whole story after Shoto implored him to ask during their talk at the sports festival. While her reasons for hating the man were very valid, Endeavor never did anything to her specifically, certainly not enough to scar her mentally. That meant that a hero in the top 10 had potentially hurt his mother badly enough in the past to leave a violent imprint on her psyche, and the piece of shit was still walking free. Izuku silenced that train of thought before it could devolve any further. Exhausted from where his thoughts were taking him, he decided to sit down. He hung his arms over the back of the bench he chose to rest on, and he let loose a long, weary exhale. He didn't move a muscle when someone sat down beside him, not even looking up at the new arrival. He did, however, extend purple flames from his fingertips down the back of the bench to the floor and pointed them upward into spikes underneath. The two sat in uninterrupted silence for half a minute until Izuku rolled his shoulders and stretched the kinks out of his neck. "So, you're clearly here to talk. Otherwise you would have attacked or at least made a halfway threatening gesture by now," Izuku finally addressed the man sitting beside him. "What's on your mind that led you to seek out a hero student in a very public setting, Tamura Shigaraki?" Tamura did not immediately respond, instead looking down at the floor between his feet. The rough skin of his clasped hands ground together as he slightly shifted and met eyes with the teen through his shaggy hair and hood, and only then did Izuku fully notice the size of the bags under the man's eyes. The young adult looked even more worn emotionally than his already haggard skin would have you believe. "Why do you want to be a hero?" he asked the student. Izuku shuffled and leaned his head back in thought while bringing his own hands together. He noted that his voice sounded markedly less gravelly than he remembered from the Asta. It felt more matured. He could ponder that later, though. "There's a lot of suffering in this world, and most of it happens in silence," Izuku responded. "With such an abundance of heroes in our country, so many people still feel so alone, abused, and forgotten. Doesn't that kinda piss you off?" "A bit of an understatement," Tamura growled. "Well, it doesn't have to be that way. So many people out there feel like they have no one to rely on, no one to reach out to, and no one looking out for or even thinking about them. So many people are being hurt in silence with no resolution. So many people are exploited by the system and then promptly forgotten about or disposed of entirely. So many people are in need with seemingly no one willing to do anything about it. At the end of the day, I just want to help people. It doesn't matter who those people are. So long as they can be helped and want to be helped, I want to be there for them. Those people who have been lost in the darkness for so long that they've all but abandoned hope of there ever being a brighter tomorrow. I want to help create that brighter tomorrow for them. I want to help them back into the light and away from their suffering. There are so many people at this very moment that heroes aren't helping, either by lack of ability or just straight up lack of desire." The teen sighed. "Sorry if I'm rambling. Your presence understandably makes me nervous." The last point really got Tamura's attention. The desire to help people was all well and good, but anyone with a cape and spandex could parrot a nice-sounding sentiment. This, however, was beginning to sound like the teen had reached the root of the issue. "What do you mean by that?" "About you making me nervous? Have you looked in the mirror?" "No, you asshole. About heroes having a lack of desire to help people in need." Izuku closed his eyes and bitterly sighed. He had been toying with these thoughts for a while, especially after the vestiges of One for All relayed the information about the dangers of passing on the quirk. "We, as a society, have become a little too reliant on All Might. I respect the man and all of the unequivocal good that he has done, but he isn't a god, no matter how obscenely powerful he is. He's just one man, and people have forgotten that. There are so many people that All Might can't do anything for because he just can't be everywhere at once, and hero society is stagnating and failing to pick up that slack because we've gotten way too comfortable. I'm so certain that people who are truly in need are overlooked every day by anyone with even the smallest ability to help because they're confident that someone more suited to handle the situation will be there eventually." Tamura silently soaked in everything the boys said. This conversation had only reaffirmed everything he previously thought about the hero student. "You're not it," Tamura finally declared after the brief silence. "HM? All Might's successor. You're not it. Your philosophies are way too different. Any successor to All Might would spout some bullshit about holding up society on their shoulders and maintaining peace with a dumbass smile, like the dumbass smiles that all these people have without even realizing how much danger they're in." Tamura cracked a dark smile. "You're right about society being way too comfortable, you know. Even right now, I could crumble 20 or 30 of them before you're able to stop me. Hell, any one of these people could just snap and unleash their quirk on these unsuspecting targets, and so many people could die. And yet, any successor to All Might would still go on about being able to save everyone as if they're omnipotent, and it would only end up prolonging and exacerbating the suffering of those in the cracks that the new symbol of peace would still be blind to." That was a lot for Izuku to take in. He took a minute to gather his thoughts before responding. "You're not wrong, though I probably wouldn't have phrased it that way. I would also hope people don't see me as All Might's successor after I explicitly denied that I wanted to be. You'd be surprised. Sensei is convinced that all your attempts to deny it are some elaborate red herring to throw people off your scent." "Sensei?" Tamura gave the teen a long look. He knew that he shouldn't be giving the enemy any details about his master and benefactor, but honestly, was the brat even an enemy at this point? If this kid, his apparent cousin, was who Sensei wanted him to kill, then was Sensei even an ally? Izuku didn't interrupt the man's musings. While he was exceptionally tense during the entire encounter, so tense that purple spikes were lying in wait to strike the villain down at the slightest aggressive movement, he wasn't unwilling to hear whatever he had to say. Honestly, as long as no one got hurt, he was content to talk with him as long as he wanted. But he wouldn't push his luck by pressing for details that the man was clearly hesitant to expand on. "There's a spot in the league for you, you know." Izuku was caught completely unawares by that curveball. "What? Are you seriously offering me a place in the League of Villains?" "Figured I'd try it the easy way first," Tamura shrugged. Deciding to put that ominous statement aside for the moment, Izuku took some time to gather the words necessary to carefully phrase his response. "Sometimes, you'll end up cracking a few eggs to make an omelet. I get that, and I accept that as a fact of life. That said, I don't know how much good I can do through villainy. I still only want to help people, after all." "You don't need to be a hero to help people," Tamura challenged. "Vigilantes exist. The only difference between a hero and a vigilante is the issue of a license," Izuku argued. "And isn't that exactly the problem? A bunch of corrupt suits pulling the strings of hero society get to arbitrarily determine who helps people and who doesn't. They determine who gets a license to kill and who's a criminal masquerading as a good Samaritan. I wonder if those suits know about the kill that you already have under your belt." Izuku had no answer to that. "I'll let you mull it over for a little while," he said before standing up and fixing him with a stern glare. "Don't take too long." Before he turned around to leave, he gave the boy a final appraisal. "Smart idea with the spikes. By the way, you're not so much of an idiot to leave yourself defenseless." With that, he turned and walked away. Izuku watched him vanish into the sea of civilians with a frown, and the purple spikes dispersed. He really didn't think that letting him walk away unhindered was a good idea, but attempting to apprehend him in the middle of a crowded shopping mall would have resulted in many preventable casualties. He was glad that the man genuinely only wanted to talk, and he would admit that their conversation felt at least somewhat productive, even if he didn't necessarily know what Tamura sought out of it. What worried him the most was the mention of Sensei. He could reason that the identity of the Sensei was All for One, and that meant that All for One believed him to be the successor of his arch-nemesis. That wasn't good. It inherently made him a target for one of the most dangerous supervillains of all time. On top of that, All for One's direct subordinate was offering him a spot in the League of Villains where the man would have direct access to him. However, maybe that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. A white flame bloomed in his hair as he began to think. Tamura Shigaraki revealed that All for One believed him to be All Might's successor, meaning that he likely believed him to be the next bearer of One for All. However, Tamura himself clearly didn't believe that to be the case, and he offered him a spot in the League of Villains despite the boy's desire to be a hero. That could either mean that he was laying a trap for the boy to be right in his master's clutches, or there was a genuine disconnect between All for One's desires and Tamura's desires. That disconnect could potentially be exploited. If All for One's desires and Tamura's desires did not align, and Tamura's desires laid much closer to Izuku's, then Izuku could attempt to build much more common ground between the two. If that was possible, perhaps he could sway him away from the evil mastermind entirely, at least long enough for All Might to take the supervillain down for good. A little bold to be using your quirk so blatantly in public like this, came a bored voice from behind him. Izuku damn near yelped in surprise, and the white flame died as he turned around to face the new arrival. He idly noted the slight headache he had, which was odd considering that he hadn't used his white flames for very long, but he focused on the man before him. The tall, lanky man peered down at him with violet eyes filled with as much boredom as his voice possessed, but Izuku could see the flicker of mirth mixed within, as well. Taking in the man's appearance, he was met with a dark red leather jacket over a black shirt and pants with chin-length crimson hair to match his jacket. His appearance wasn't what put him on edge, though. It was the fact that the man managed to sneak up on him that made him nervous. Not even Tamura had gone undetected when he approached. He offered the man a sheepish smile when he remembered that the man had said something to kick off the interaction, and the mirth in the man's lackadaisical gaze grew more pronounced. "Don't fret, I won't report it," the man lightly assured before meandering around the bench to take the empty spot. Izuku noted that his footsteps were totally soundless. The redhead gave Izuku a considering gaze before closing his eyes and slouching in his spot on the bench. "Frankly, I don't particularly care for how stringent quirk use laws in Japan are. I much prefer the Western model where they're a little more liberal about our natural gifts." "I get that," Izuku noncommittally replied while keeping a wary eye on the man. "It would be a lot more convenient at times." "You don't have to be so vigilant, little hero," the man nonchalantly commented with a wave of his hand. That did not assuage Izuku's wariness at all. "How do you know I'm a hero student?" "I recognized you from the UA Sports Festival," he yawned. "I'm sure a lot of people here have for other reasons as well." "Oh, right. He was famous. Triply so, given the interview and the stain video." "Can I ask you a question?" the man inquired, and Izuku nodded. "I'd like to hear your opinion on a hypothetical situation involving a villain, heroes, and civilians. Let's say someone like the sludge villain attacks and takes a hostage for their quirk. I wonder what happened to him, by the way." Izuku did his best not to visibly tense up at the mention of the sludge villain, and the lack of notice from the man somewhat eased his mind that he was successful. Anyway, let's say the civilian had a destructive quirk that allowed the sludge villain to cause widespread damage on his rampage. Meanwhile, the civilian is alive and suffocating, but the pro-heroes on scene can't get to them for one reason or another. Maybe their quirks just aren't conducive to the situation. Maybe it's incompetence, maybe it's just laziness. The point is that an innocent is dying and nothing is being done about it. This was a very specific hypothetical, and it did nothing to ease Izuku's nerves about him. Now, say a particularly brave, or stupid, civilian decided to step in since no one else would, and it just so happened that his quirk or specific set of skills allowed him to rescue the hostage himself. Or, at the very least, he made it much easier for the heroes to do so. Do you, as a pro-hero, punish that man for his actions? That was such a needlessly long way around asking for my opinions on vigilantism, Izuku thought with a deadpan expression. I mean, what he did is technically vigilantism, and that is illegal, Izuku carefully began. On the same token, I wouldn't begrudge him for doing it, and I wouldn't make much of an effort to apprehend him for it. Granted, I wouldn't be the only hero on scene, so it would fall out of my hands at some point. But if I couldn't take down the sludge villain to rescue a hostage, I'm not that great of a hero. The man hummed and nodded slightly. I suppose you do have experience with that? Izuku was taken aback by that statement, and now he was really on edge. That comment could have been an innocuous observation based on his rather public interaction with the hero killer, but it could have also been a subtle nod to what happened at the I-Expo. The latter wasn't likely because how the hell would he have known about that? At the same time, why was the hypothetical so focused on the sludge villain if he wasn't aware of what happened? It was just too unsettling to be a coincidence. Izuku's intense gaze bore into the half-lidded, violet eyes slightly obscured by the red hair of the man beside him, and he could swear that he saw even more mirth dancing behind the boredom. It was as if the man was reveling in plausible deniability, and he knew that Izuku knew it. Just who the hell was this guy? Your friend is here, he spoke again, and Izuku turned to see Ochako approaching them with a few bags in her hand and curiosity written across her face. Izuku? Who's this? She inquired, none the wiser to their conversation and Izuku's anxiety. Just someone who recognized us from the sports festival, he quickly answered before standing up and wrapping a stiff arm around her. Let's go meet up with the others. Oh okay, she stammered as he led her away from the bench. A small smirk found purchase on Kusari's face as he watched the two teens depart. He could practically taste the boy's discomfort. It wasn't quite fear, but he could feel that the boy knew that he was prey, and his quirk nearly unleashed itself in a frenzy to chase after them. Izuku Midoriya, Kusari hummed. I somewhat see why Curious is so enamored with you. When the time comes, I wonder if you'll be liberated of your shackles or liberated of your life. A hero to help those that hero society has failed, huh? Tomura mused to himself after stepping through the entrance of the bar. A genuinely noble conviction, who would have thought? It's too bad that they'll be calling him a villain sympathizer when shit inevitably hits the fan. What is it, Tomura? Kurogiri asked the man. Just thinking about our person of interest, Tomura lightly replied. Anything from Jurin? He mentioned that he had an acquaintance with a powerful cloning quirk that's willing to work, the misty man answered. I would expect him to be back sometime this week. Might I make a suggestion, Tomura? Came the voice of their sensei from the monitor. Tomura turned a hesitant eye to the screen in question before nodding. He had a considerable bone to pick with him about what the man knew of his past, but he could swallow it for the moment if only for the sake of self-preservation. What is it, sensei? You've done a splendid job at fielding recruits, but I believe you are leaving money on the table, so to speak, the man stated. How so? Tomura slowly questioned, trying to figure out just where his sensei was going. You have collected a few that are clearly competent, but they, for the most part, either lack true experience or the raw power to properly capitalize on that experience. Until you can mold them into reliable dragons, it would be prudent to find already battle-tested pawns to hold down the fort. Who do you have in mind? I'm so glad you asked, Tomura. I have had my eye on a few that have successfully fought and defeated pro-heroes in the past, one even killing a duo of them with relative ease. You don't have I? Yes, I am well aware of that, Tomura Shigaraki. The point remains that battle-tested acumen would do wonders for the efficacy of the group, even if they stray a little far into wanton violence without reason for your updated sensibilities. Tomura would not lash out at the obvious jab. He would not. He probably earned it after the attempted crack at Sensei's lack of eyes. He also had to concede that the man made a good point. If they were going to make a proper impression as an organization, then proper, destructive firepower was exactly what they needed. Some pointless murder and destruction was a small price to pay for the end of All Might's society. Gotta crack a few eggs to make an omelet, Tomura muttered, echoing the words he had heard earlier that day. Precisely, Tamura, all for one commented with an unseen grin. And, courtesy of our ever-loyal informant, I know just where to begin making the omelet. Izuku closed the front door of the apartment behind him. He promised himself that he would address the subject with his mother when he returned home, and he would do so. His mother was in pain, and not a goddamn soul would stop him from rectifying that. He stepped into the living room and found his mother watching TV with a cup of tea in hand. She sent him a warm smile when she noticed him, and he gave her a shaky one in return. Her smile somewhat dimmed at that, and she moved over and beckoned for him to sit down beside her. "How was your trip to the mall?" she asked him while softly running her hand through his hair, and he instinctively slumped and leaned into her touch despite being taller than her. "It was," he began before pausing to consider how eventful the simple mall trip ended up being. "Enlightening, I suppose?" "Oh?" his mother replied with curiosity brimming in her gaze. "How so?" "I'll tell you later," he deflected, deciding to get right to the meat and potatoes. Inko's brow furrowed, and she curiously regarded her son, who was looking anywhere but at her for a few moments. "Mom," he softly began, and he finally brought his gaze up to meet hers. "What happened?" Inko's eyes briefly widened, and then she deflated with a sigh before looking back at her son with the most tired gaze that he had ever seen her sport. "I knew this was coming eventually. I just hoped that I could continue ignoring it for a little while longer." Izuku remained silent while she continued rubbing circles on his scalp with a small, sad smile. "I never told you why I lost hope in heroics," she remarked softly, and another silence followed in which she continued her ministrations and the energy continued to leave her. Izuku did not like seeing his mother so defeated. "When I was still a student, I interned with Musha," she began in a sullen tone that betrayed the smile she tried to maintain for her son. "He taught me quite a bit. He refined my fighting style with a decent repertoire of martial arts that he helped me make my own and create a personalized style out of. Afterward, I did work study with his agency whenever I could." Her sad smile became a bit wistful. "He showed a bright-eyed teenage girl who just wanted to help people the glamorous bits of hero society, and he trained me to take on the world and serve the people the best I could. I really enjoyed my time with him." Then her smile vanished. "And then I didn't." When she didn't elaborate, Izuku tried to rein in his bubbling rage. He could feel the ever-so-familiar heat shoot through his soul and fight to overtake his being. He was then drawn into a warm, firm hug from his mother, and the rage slowly drained away in her embrace. "I'll spare you the details," she finally said, neither party breaking the embrace. "Just know that he wasn't unique in that regard, and neither was I. When I graduated and started interacting with heroes a lot more, I very quickly learned that he and so many others are only in it for the fame and wealth." She paused to amend her thought and shifted without breaking the hug. "Well, those that survive in the business long enough to afford to indulge are in it for those things, anyway. It's why I decided to go underground. People are usually on the up and up down there, although you do have the few who use it to get into the drug and trigger trades." The two sat in the embrace for another lengthy silence. Inko resumed her rubbing of her son's scalp, and he returned the affection by rubbing her back. "Did you ever report it?" Izuku asked after another minute in the hug. She sighed again, and Izuku already didn't like what the answer would be. That's the thing about making accusations against someone in a position of power when the government agency that it inevitably falls to has an implicit stake in maintaining the status quo. "So, nothing was ever done about it, then?" "Like I said, I'm not a unique case." "That doesn't make it okay," Izuku actually shouted, pulling away from the hug. "He hurt you, and who knows how many others. He hurt you. He shouldn't just get to continue life with impunity." "No, it's not okay," Inko calmly answered without backing down from her incensed son. "But it isn't your revenge to take." Whatever reply Izuku would have uttered died in his throat when he processed what she said. Inko watched the sparks of black that had briefly returned when he shouted fade away once more. "I know that look, Izuku," she began, and he couldn't meet her gaze anymore. "I had it for years. It was all I could think about. It bled into my work. I vented all of that hatred, that rage, that disgust, and that disappointment in myself. I poured it all out onto criminals. I pistol-whipped a mugger until he cried, 'Izuku.'" Izuku minutely perked up at the mention of that, as he remembered Gyro telling him that same story. "I was so filled with hatred that it even cost me a friendship," she continued. "That wasn't the person I wanted to be, but it was the person I became. I wouldn't let it be the hero I was, too." "So, that's why you retired," Izuku surmised. "I was no longer living up to my desire to help people," she confirmed. "I was just coping by hurting others. For those fleeting moments, I felt in control again. This is the reality that I wanted to shield you from. You don't deserve to have it beat you down, too." Izuku remained silent, and his gaze fell away from his mother once again. The more he learned about the state of heroics, the less he enjoyed the thought of participating in the system. "Besides," she continued, "Musha is just one of many commission flunkies to take down. Some are much dirtier than others. They'll all get what's coming to them in due time, and I'll be right there to watch the bastard burn." "What exactly do you mean by that?" Izuku hesitantly questioned. "The rat works in mysterious ways," she cryptically answered with a smile, and Izuku sighed, knowing that was the best answer he would get. Then he felt his mother wrap him into another, even warmer hug. "You truly are my greatest achievement, Izuku. If everything that happened over the course of my life was necessary in order to have you, I wouldn't change a thing." Izuku didn't fight the tears that welled up and trailed down his freckled cheeks at that statement, and he buried himself in her embrace with equal fervor. All the while, he was hard at work ignoring the growing sensation deep within him. It was a dark, flaming abyss that yearned for retribution. If there was one thing Izuku learned over the course of the semester, it was that sleep, like kneecaps, was a privilege and not a right. Whether it was agonizing over the littlest, least meaningful decisions in his life, or waking up in a cold sweat after reliving the death of the sludge villain for the 100th time, Izuku was no stranger to losing sleep. This night was no different, as the events of the day had finally come down on him. Tamura Shigaraki had offered him a spot in the League of Villains. He was seriously offered a place in the League of Villains. What was he supposed to say to that? He felt that the two of them had come to a sort of understanding, but for the man to have extended him that kind of offer, he didn't quite know how to feel about the implications. He decided to keep it to himself for the moment. Then there was the red-headed man who hinted at knowing the truth about the sludge villain with all the subtlety of a parade of flaccid flopping in the wind. If the man was trying to play mind games with him, he very much succeeded. He needed to figure out just who the hell the man was and what the hell his angle even was. Unlike with the meeting with Tamura, he did send a warning to Nezu about that interaction. Someone had gotten their hands on classified information and felt comfortable enough to all but tell Izuku that they had it. Finally, there was the source of the present subjects, his mother. He got confirmation on a name, but as much as every fiber of his being quite literally burned with the desire to hunt the son of a bitch down, his mother made him promise to leave it be if for no other reason than to not deprive her of her own catharsis when the time came. He would gladly do that for his mother, and he would ensure that he got a front row seat. As Hisashi Midoriya found out for himself, and all for one would certainly find out soon, you don't mess with a Chimera and live to tell the tale. Unbeknownst to a snoozing Toshinori, One for All was lightly humming. Within the quirk, Nana Shimura felt a sudden wave of unbridled vindication. "You're goddamn right, you don't," she muttered to herself, much to the confusion of the other vestiges. They shrugged it off and just assumed that she had finally lost what was left of her sanity. Needless to say, Izuku had a lot on his mind, and sleep was just not in the cards for him. He'd generally just browse through his phone in situations like this, which may or may not have been counterproductive to getting back to sleep. But mindless doom scrolling was the easiest, most readily available solution. As such, that was what he found himself doing once again at 2:30 a.m. It wasn't absolutely pertinent that he got back to sleep since he didn't have school in the morning and his flight to Island wasn't until the day after, so he afforded himself a dive through hero forums. He hadn't been spending a ton of time on them after the Hasu incident since seeing discussions about himself in relation to Stain made him feel weird. The memes were one thing, but some users like All Black Cat and GEICO who were firmly in the Stain had a point camp consistently argued with those in the "a villain with valid points is still a villain" and Stain was a ridiculous psychopath camps about himself and Shoto. He primarily saw a lot of talk about the merit of Stain's stamp of approval in regards to his validity as a true hero. Those in the former camp argued that a man who explicitly killed heroes he deemed to be unfit for the title by his admittedly ludicrous standards, finding someone to be worthy was inherently significant. All Black Cat in particular seemed to be rather violently in his corner, consistently arguing that his desire to help people was genuine enough that even a serial killer could see it. That made him feel good. On the other hand, he got the feeling that GEICO just wanted to talk up Stain whenever they could. He was a little worried about that one, in all honesty. However, those in the latter two camps argued that a crazy man deeming something to meet his standards didn't make it significant, and arguing from the position that it did only gave the crazy man's ramblings more power than they actually deserved. Some even insisted that a kid who wanted to help the downtrodden being endorsed by an explicit hero killer says more about the kid's appeal to villains than his appeal to civilized society. He could certainly see the logic in the first point, but the second one kind of hurt. Even beyond the Stain topics, visits to those forums just didn't hit the same as they did before he started at UA. The debates he got into with Futuravision 420 over All Might's diminishing presence in the public weren't as satisfying once he learned about All Might's injury. There was nothing to speculate anymore, so he just found himself agreeing with the user's ravenous defense of All Might. His scrolling was interrupted when he received a text from an unfamiliar number. "Midoriya? It's Vanta." That certainly surprised him. Vanta hadn't spoken to him much during his internship, and it had been weeks since then. He got a few messages from some of the others in the VRP, but none from her. Given her hesitance to share much of her story while he was there, getting a random text from her was certainly a nice surprise. "Vanta, hey, it's great to hear from you. How are you?" "I'm alive. You know how that goes." Izuku truly did not know how to take that statement, so he moved past it. "Fair enough. What have you been up to?" Same old, same old. We can't exactly leave the campus unsupervised, probably for our own good." Izuku conceded that point. It only made sense that their movements were restricted until they were fully rehabilitated. They presumably didn't teach small talk classes, though, and Izuku had never been great at it either, so he was at risk of fumbling through the rest of the conversation if it kept up like this. "I get that. How did you encounter Stain?" There it was. The username All Black Cat started to make a lot of sense. My friend was being an idiot and trying to get revenge for his brother. "So you did fight him, then? It was an endeavor like the official reports say?" "I won't confirm or deny anything. That's basically a yes, you know? Not according to the rules of plausible deniability. I'm 99% sure that's not how that works, but all right." Izuku wouldn't say that he wasn't enjoying talking to her, but he felt like she didn't just text him out of the blue to ask him something she likely already knew the answer to. "Is something on your mind?" There was a pause for a few minutes, and Izuku figured that he hit the nail on the head, and she was either trying to formulate a response or working up the nerve to come out and say whatever was troubling her. "Do you think anyone can be a hero?" Well, of all the unexpected questions to receive, that was certainly on the lighter end of the scale. He definitely didn't think that just anyone should be a hero anymore, but he could infer that wasn't what she was asking him. Anyone with the capacity to do good can be a hero. Even a mutant with a villainous quirk and a rap sheet. The sins of your past have no bearing on the lives you can save in the future. There's also no such thing as a villainous quirk, and anyone who says otherwise is a wit. Another pause followed, and Izuku patiently awaited her response. I knew you were cool. A smile graced Izuku's face at her text. It took all of his willpower to opt out of asking her about her quirk since it was already really late, and he knew that he'd badger her with questions about it for hours if he could. Look, it's coming into view. The world's very own bastion of research and baby-making. I can already feel all the beautiful babies I'm going to make. May was practically salivating with her face pressed against the window of the private jet as they made their steady approach to the vaunted island, much to the amusement of Izuku and discomfort of Toshinori. He still didn't really know how to feel about another person being let in on his biggest secret. After the girl had pretty much figured out his identity on her own within a minute of meeting him, he ushered them into the teacher's lounge and made her swear an oath of silence about the whole thing. When she did, he told her about his injury and his time limit, but nothing more than that. What surprised him, however, was how little she seemed to care, at least outwardly. She really just seemed happy to be included, not really caring about the truth behind All Might's identity one way or the other. Maybe she just didn't show it, but either way, Toshinori would be lying if he said his pride wasn't a little wounded. She seems excited, Izuku mused to the older man sitting across the aisle. Yeah, she does, he sighed. I'm genuinely afraid of what a brain like hers could get up to on I-Island. I could start on something that extends your time limit. The girl in question excitedly declared to Toshinori, and the two other occupants of the jet were very much taken aback. She didn't freak out or react very strongly when she was brought into the fold, so both assumed that she just took the information in stride and didn't obsess over it because it had little to do with inventing and designing gear. In actuality, the idea of the symbol of peace being constrained by a time limit that kept him out of the picture for 21 hours out of any given day unsettled her, and she had a few thoughts about the situation that she didn't really know what to make of. Well, at least until you can find someone to pass your quirk on to, she finished in a more subdued tone, and Toshinori practically hacked up his remaining lung. How do you know about that? He demanded. You were muttering about finding a successor and passing on your quirk in your sleep earlier, she answered, and Toshinori paled while Izuku facepalmed. Real nice, All Might, Izuku muttered through his hands. Toshinori heavily sighed, and he fixed May with a serious look. You cannot tell a soul about what you heard. I figured, she shrugged. Are you close to finding one? Unfortunately, I'm not, the man denied with a downcast expression. I had a few in mind, but certain circumstances made them unfit for the role through no fault of their own. For right now, one for all will stay with me. May nodded and returned her gaze to the window. Meanwhile, Izuku had brought his head from his hands and turned his attention to Toshinori. Does that have to change? He asked him, and Toshinori's brow furrowed. What do you mean, young Midoriya? He asked with a bit of confusion. Why wouldn't he pass on one for all? Izuku mulled over his thoughts for a long moment, and even May brought her gaze from the floating city in the distance to the green-haired teen. You're the symbol of peace, the boy began. You've done so much good for our society. Your presence still does so much for keeping society stable, and without you, who knows what kind of hell we would be plunged into. Toshinori nodded. He knew that much already. It was why passing on the quirk was so important, as he wouldn't be around forever. But have you ever considered that as much good as your status does us, it also does as much harm? Izuku asked him. Before Toshinori could rebut, Izuku held his hand up and continued. I don't mean you as a hero, I mean what you represent. You're not just a symbol, you're also a pillar holding up the current order. Society needs you in order to exist, or, more accurately, society needs one for all as it's currently constructed. Exactly, Toshinori agreed. That's why it's crucial that I find a successor to be the pillar that society rests on when I can no longer be that. But there doesn't have to be just one pillar, don't you think? You told me that I'm going to be a great symbol in the future, and I do want to be, but I don't want to be the symbol. It's a double-edged sword. Society resting on a singular pillar is dangerous. No matter how strong that pillar is, it's just one pillar, and it'll never be infallible. It has to be, Toshinori pressed. But it won't be, Izuku stood his ground. Your injury is proof of that. Toshinori flinched, but the boy wasn't wrong, and he knew it. He just barely survived that battle with All for One, and even now, he wasn't entirely convinced that he had enough power to finish the job if the supervillain truly survived having his head caved in 5 years prior. May, meanwhile, was silently watching the discussion unfold. The thoughts she had about All Might and his condition were being echoed on both sides of the debate. After a lengthy silence, the man resignedly sighed. What do you suggest? Before Izuku could say anything, May spoke up, surprising the two of them. How about more than one pillar? When the two males turned to look at her, she continued. If someone is strong enough to take down one pillar, then they're probably strong enough to take down multiple, though maybe not all at once. There's no sense in making it easier on them by just having one pillar to take down to cause the downfall of society. 4 legs make a sturdier table than 3, which make a sturdier table than 2. Seeing exactly where she was going with her analogy, Izuku's eyes brightened. And the 4 legs wouldn't have to be as thick as a single leg would have to be to support the entire weight of the table. And knocking down one leg wouldn't bring down the entire thing. Well, I suppose that depends on the shape and composition of the table. You know what? We're getting lost in the analogy. While the two teens were going on about tables, Toshinori was considering everything the youngsters said. He would readily admit that they made a good point that a singular pillar wasn't infallible, and without added help to keep society standing, removing that pillar would bring the whole thing down, and his injury was doing just that. Still, though, that's nothing that passing on the quirk won't address, right? Having multiple pillars for society would be fantastic. But how feasible was it with the power they wielded? Maybe if he plucked 2 hairs from his head and offered them to 2 different people. No. What the F? No. Absolutely not, Toshi. Don't do that, you got him, bonehead. My brother is going to win at this rate. For some reason, Toshinori felt like that was a bad idea. Looking at the two teens animatedly spiraling into a conversation about combat-ready tables and something about babies that spat fire, a fond smile took form on his face. He was reminded of days gone with David by his side when he watched them interact. Still, they had an important discussion to continue. Wouldn't the issue of needing multiple pillars still be able to be addressed while having a wielder of one for all? Toshinori asked the two teens. I mean, sure, it could be, Izuku began, but you're still thinking about it in terms of one sturdy pillar holding up society with a couple of others that aren't as sturdy providing support. A villain or force of villains who want to take down society would still need to be strong enough to take down that main pillar. They'd have to be as powerful as you. That's a pretty tall order, Toshinori commented. It would be, for most, Izuku replied, and Toshinori stiffened. He didn't know that the boy was aware of All for One potentially still being alive, but the point still remained. Besides, May spoke up again, it's better if heroes and society at large don't have a specific get-out-of-jail-free card so that they don't rest on their laurels. Complacency is the enemy of progress, after all. Just something to think about, Izuku finished off as the two teens turned to watch the approaching floating city from their windows. The boy was right. Toshinori had quite a bit to think about. So long as All for One was still alive, One for All needed to exist, and thus a symbol of peace needed to be around. However, what about after that? His entire mission had been to save the world with a smile, be the symbol of peace that society needed, and avenge his sensei for as long as he could remember. Was he even allowed to think about what came afterward when the job hasn't even been finished yet? After making it through immigration inspection, the two costumed men and uniformed woman entered the fray of festivities for the pre-opening of I-Expo. The teens' reactions to the new environment were as amusing to All Might as he expected they would be. They were gawking at the open quirk usage first and foremost. Unlike in Japan, people are allowed to use their quirks however they wish on I-Island, All Might explained. Whoa, Izuku remarked in complete wonder. Both he and his destructive companion felt like they were in a fantasy world. I much prefer the Western model where they are a little more liberal about our natural gifts. So, that's what he meant, Izuku muttered to himself quietly enough that neither would hear him, or so he thought. Quirk laws in Japan are pretty restrictive. They've always been that way, All Might responded with a light sigh. It was a whole thing for a while, even decades ago before my time. I-Island is technically international land, but the United States has the most significant influence over it, so their more lax philosophy on quirk use carried over here. Izuku ignored his slight embarrassment at being heard in favor of his intrigue at the information he was given. People can use their quirks as they please, and there's no crime to speak of. It was May who answered this time. Don't mistake correlation for causation. It's likely a cultural thing in tandem with the fact that this place has a security system that's second to none. All Might nodded with his signature grin. He maintained his grin when he was recognized and immediately swarmed by both fans and the media. Despite the grin, All Might was not having a good time. He was one of, if not the most famous pro-hero on the planet, so the attention was very much expected. But that wasn't the end of it. Regardless of how easy it was for the two teens with him to figure out his identity, no one else had done the same up to that point. As far as the world was concerned, All Might was 220 cm and built like a brick shithouse at all times. That meant that All Might had to stay buffed up every second he was in public. It would be murder on him, but so long as he wasn't forced to do anything particularly strenuous, he'd be fine. What could possibly go wrong on I-Island, anyway? The place had better security measures than Tartarus. No one would be stupid enough to stage any attacks at the expo. Someone would have to be a complete and utter imbecile to think they could possibly get away with that. There you are, Uncle Might, came an excited voice from afar, accompanied by the spring of a clearly modified pogo stick. Joyfully bounding over to the group was a blonde teenage girl with round glasses over her blue eyes. Izuku was confused at the way she addressed All Might so familiarly, while May's eyes immediately zeroed in on the pogo stick she was riding. When the girl finally made it to them, she and All Might leaped into a hug and started catching up. Izuku patiently stood to the side and out of the way to not interrupt the clear reconnection. And as the conversation progressed without either acknowledging him whatsoever, he looked over to May to see if she was feeling as awkward as he was. As he should have expected, she was no longer beside him. Instead, she was closely inspecting every inch of the unique pogo stick and practically salivating all the while. He could only shake his head and softly chuckle, and that finally got All Might's attention and reminded him that he had stragglers with him. Oh, right, young Midoriya. Allow me to introduce you to my friend Dave's daughter, All Might motioned to her. It's really nice to meet you, she said with a smile. I'm Melissa Shield. Shield? Like David Shield? MHM. He's my dad. Holy hell, that's so cool, Izuku began before cutting off his fanboying. It's nice to meet you, too. I'm Izuku Midoriya, a first year at UA. I knew you looked familiar, Melissa remarked with recognition blooming on her face. You put on a show at the UA Sports Festival. I didn't recognize you in costume. Fantastic work from what I can tell. By the way, who designed it? Izuku fought off his blush from the momentary praise, and he pointed to his designated support technician and costume designer that was still looking over the pogo stick, though she now had a notebook in hand and was furiously scribbling down everything she took note of. Closer inspection revealed that it was one of Izuku's own notebooks. How in the world she got it, he didn't know and wouldn't ask. However, before he could introduce her to Melissa, She popped to her feet with a grin and entered the taller girl's personal space, as if sensing that it was time to sell herself. Mei Hatsum, inventor extraordinaire in U.S. support course and future CEO of Hatsum Industries, she proudly declared, and she only backed off to extend a hand to her. Melissa, completely unfazed by the shorter girl's antics, excitedly took the hand. "Did you make this baby?" Mei asked, motioning to the pogo stick. "Yes, but not on the first date," the taller girl answered, and Izuku almost chortled while All Might nearly lost his buff form when he hacked up a glob of blood. "There are no springs in it at all," Mei marveled. "Yep, it's 100% plot-powered," Melissa excitedly replied. Before Izuku could question that statement, Melissa turned to him and slightly bent down to his level to closely inspect him. Had he not been accustomed to Mei already doing that whenever he entered the lab, he would have been beet red at the sudden proximity. "Your costume is really well done," she remarked while looking him over. "Could use a hood, though. Costumes feel incomplete without one, in my personal opinion." She then took one of his arms in her hands. "I especially like the gauntlets doubling as bracers, presumably for the strength enhancer component of your quirk." At his nod, she continued on to inspecting his rebreather. "I feel like this is incomplete." "It was supposed to double as a respirator to keep oxygen circulating within him when he's in speedster mode," Mei explained. "I haven't yet figured out a way to accomplish that without blowing him up, though." That would indeed be counterproductive," she lightly remarked, as if they weren't discussing the prospect of him literally exploding. "Tell you what, we can brainstorm in my lab later today." Mei could lay claim to possessing 2 whole galaxies with the amount of stars in her eyes at the proposal, but All Might cleared his throat to get Melissa's attention before Mei could say anything. "Oh, sorry, I got distracted," she apologized before grabbing her pogo stick. Izuku and Mei were transfixed by the pogo stick quickly collapsing in on itself and becoming a chip that she stuffed into her pocket. Neither had ever seen any kind of technology like that in Japan or anywhere else, for that matter. Whatever she said about her dad's lab was lost to the both of them as they mindlessly followed behind the 2 blondes. On an overlook at the immigration inspection, a tall, burly man with long, brown hair and a very pronounced scar covering the majority of his face put his phone away after making contact with his man on the inside. 3 p.m. At Gate 66. Good. Should this go as smoothly as we planned, we'll make a fortune off of that dumbass scientist. So caught up in his cliché, villainous ramblings was he that he wasn't paying attention to his surroundings. Had he been doing so, he just might have noticed a man idly slink past him without his steps making a single sound. After all, Might and David Shield reunited after so many years, David noticed the faint smoke wafting off of his old friend, so he sent his daughter away to give the 2 visiting teens a tour of the island. Izuku and Mei were again struck by how fantastical the island felt. It strongly resembled a massive amusement park fused with a sprawling metropolis. "This place is really amazing," Izuku breathed out. "I can't believe the whole thing is man-made. Holy shit, that's Godzilla." "Oh yeah, we invite a lot of pro heroes here all the time to showcase support gear and test out new designs," Melissa responded with a laugh. Izuku wandered over to the massive hero actor that was twice as tall as All Might. The reptilian pro stopped when he noticed the boy's approach, and he bent down to be closer to his level. "Excuse me, Godzilla?" he asked while holding out a notebook to an open page, and the massive pro gladly took the offered notebook and pen. "Who do I make it out to?" Godzilla asked in his soft yet booming voice. "Setsuna Takage," he answered, and the large pro paused in confusion for a moment before reasoning that the autograph was for someone else entirely. After signing the page and then handing the notebook back, the 2 posed for a quick picture. "Could I ask you an important question?" Izuku queried after putting his phone away. "Fire away," the mini kaiju replied. "Could you beat All Might in a fight?" Bemusement was the immediate reaction, not just from Godzilla, but from Mei and Melissa as well. What? The pro questioned. Could you beat All Might in a fight? Izuku repeated, completely undeterred. A pregnant silence followed, and Godzilla's expression was almost unreadable. It didn't help that the man did not have the capacity for human facial expressions, but Izuku spent enough time around Tsu to pick up on pensive blankness. If you're asking who would win between All Might and Godzilla, legally, I can't say, Godzilla carefully answered. Endes were a pain when movies found themselves in development hell. Izuku deflated at the non-answer, but he accepted it nonetheless and thanked the hero for his time. Upon returning to the duo of girls, he ignored Melissa smirking amusedly at him in favor of sending the picture he took with Godzilla to Talkage with a special caption. "Suck it, nerd." It took less than a minute for a reply to come. "I'm gonna strangle you at training camp, you rat bastard." "Oh, I know exactly where we should check out next," Melissa exclaimed, and she pointed to a large building just up ahead of them. "It's a showcase of the newest hero items and support tech to come out of the island." May gasped and practically started vibrating. "What are we waiting for? Let's go see the newest babies." The trio were prepared to scamper off, but Izuku was frozen in place when he heard a familiar thumping in a crescendo. His instincts screamed at him to flee, but his better judgment knew that would make things worse. He dared not look behind him at his approaching doom, instead resigning to his fate and praying that it would be over quickly. "Ha! I knew it was you I spotted," a mature voice declared with a frightening amount of glee. The tan, muscly arm that wrapped around his neck and put him in a headlock draped in a curtain of white hair only confirmed his fears. "Hi, Mirko," Izuku lamented. "I did not come prepared to be thrashed on this trip." "And that's a problem. You should be ready to throw down at all times," Mirko jokingly, he hoped, reprimanded. "You two go on ahead," Izuku told the inventor duo ahead of him. "I'll catch up at some point." "Are you sure?" Melissa asked. "I don't mind waiting." "Yeah, it's totally fine," Izuku assured before motioning to the still vibrating May. "You keep her waiting any longer, and I'm afraid she'll legitimately combust." Melissa took note of the faint smoke coming from May's vibrating form, and she nodded and ushered the shorter girl away toward the showcase. "So, my favorite little thief, the hell are you doing here?" Mirko asked the teen after releasing him from her hold. "I came with All Might," Izuku answered with a shrug. The rabbit hero whistled. "How the hell did you manage that? Usually +1s are reserved for family or close friends." "His late sensei was apparently my grandmother, so in terms of family, my mom and I are practically the closest he's got," Izuku responded. "How about you? I don't think I would have ever imagined you taking time off for anything." "That's because of me," another, much more exasperated female voice called from behind them, and Izuku turned to see Ryukyu approaching them and giving the boy an apologetic grimace. "There's a panel for giant, reptilian pro-heroes tomorrow. You might have seen Godzilla or Indominus around already, actually. Bringing her along was the only way I could force her to take a vacation." "Vacations are for the weak," Mirko rebuked. "You work non-stop across the country," Ryukyu argued. "The only break you've taken in the past 6 months was to beat up this kid for imitating one of your super moves." "And it was goddamn worth it," Mirko replied with a toothy grin that very much unsettled Izuku. His distress grew even more when she turned the grin onto him. "Time to see how you've improved since your internship, fiery klepto." Izuku's prayers for a swift end went unanswered that day. Nezu looked over the footage from the security cameras of the mall that Class 1 had visited a final time. He truly wished he had more to work with, but all he could do is stare a hole into the screen where a man with red hair and a red leather jacket casually wandered by. This was the man that his protege had informed him of, the man who knew much more than he should. The Chimera principal took every measure he could to scrub any evidence of the sludge villain even being at the Asti. There was no mention of him in any of the reports. Any security footage of him was either altered or eliminated entirely, and the students who witnessed the event were sworn to silence about it. Even still, he had obtained knowledge of it, meaning he either was one of the criminals present or was working with someone capable of retrieving that evidence electronically. All of the criminals aside from Tamura Shigaraki and Kurogiri were apprehended and accounted for, so that ruled out the first option. The second option was far more worrisome, as it implied that there were parties capable of infiltrating U.S. networks and leaving with sensitive information beyond his notice. That was absolutely unacceptable, and he would have anyone and everyone responsible killed. He would work tirelessly to rectify the situation. He'd have to get into contact with Ms. Aba again, it seemed. Just then, he received an alert from the cameras outside of his office at the approach of Inko, and he smiled. Hopping down from his chair, he made it to the door just before Inko reached for the handle, and opened it himself with his usual almost human smile on display. Inko, far too used to his antics by now, stepped inside without missing a beat and sat down in one of the two chairs in front of his desk. "So, you called me in for an important meeting," Inko began with a quirked eyebrow. "You requested I be in costume, too, so I figured it was important." "Indeed it is, but let us wait on our third participant," Nezu responded, climbing back into his chair. "I will admit that even I was taken by surprise when he contacted me, but I do love a good plot twist." Inko frowned at the vagueness, but she remained silent. If Nezu was playing it up, he certainly had a reason. "While we wait for his arrival, I must ask how you've been doing these last few days," Nezu said with a much more subdued expression. Inko momentarily stilled, but she relaxed just as quickly. "I'm doing okay." Izu was worried, and I couldn't exactly blame him. "Did you talk with him about it?" "Yes." "How did he take it?" "He was angry. I didn't give him specifics, but I didn't really have to. Had I not dissuaded him, he'd be out for blood. I'm not entirely convinced that he isn't still, but I think he has enough respect for the concept of dibs to leave it be." Nezu nodded, and he poured the woman a cup of tea before retrieving his own already full cup. When he looked back at the monitors on his desk displaying the feeds from the cameras, his smile returned once more. "Ah, it seems he has arrived," the Chimera noted, and he repeated his actions from before. This time, though, his smile was much less casual than the one he offered to his longtime comrade. "I'm glad you're here. I would have never expected you to request a meeting like this." "You were the only person I could risk coming to about it," came a deep voice that Inko instantly recognized, and pure hatred filled her to her very core. She slowly turned her body to face the doorway, and her gaze became utterly venomous. "Endeavor," she practically spat. The man in question became rigid upon seeing her, and he turned a narrowed gaze onto the animal. "Why is she here?" he demanded. "This involves her son just as much as it involves your own," Nezu calmly replied before returning to his chair. "Please, have a seat. She will play nice." Endeavor, despite himself, hesitantly sat down in the open seat beside the woman who was staring daggers at him. She finally ripped her glare away from him and refocused on the smiling Chimera, and Nezu offered the man a cup of tea, which he accepted. "Now, it appears that we all have a common enemy," Nezu began. "The Hero Public Safety Commission is starting to poke its bureaucratic nose into things, right, Endeavor?" The flame hero snorted, and the flames dressing his face brightened minutely. "Recently, the HPSC sent an agent to my home to discuss the ripples of the Stain video. It was less of a discussion and more of a thinly veiled threat to keep my son on a leash, or else—" "Or else what?" Nezu asked while maintaining his smile, and Inko's smoldering glare would have killed a lesser man. "They threatened to no longer look the other way in regards to my family," Endeavor muttered. "It'd be about time," Inko scoffed. Endeavor's gaze darkened, and he turned to address the woman with a snarl. "You've had something to get off your chest for years, so just say it." Inko was initially doing her best to hold in her vitriol while being around Endeavor, but the mention of his family and even a passing allusion to the abuse he put them through made her crack. Now, however, she was seeing red, and she shot up from her seat. You deplorable piece of shit, how dare you? You snatch a woman away from her family and treat her as nothing more than a means to an end to create your perfect specimens. And then you spend 15 years putting her and your children through horrible abuse, and you don't even have the decency to own up to it. You stripped a woman of her humanity and viewed your children as experiments that were either successes or failures. You broke Ray mentally, killed your oldest son, and nearly created a ticking time bomb in your youngest. And then you have the gall to only admit to such when the most corrupt institution on the planet threatens to stop covering for your sick behavior. Endeavor was nearing his boiling point. He would not be shouted at and decried like some misbehaving child. He was the no-2 hero, got him it. He worked himself to the bone to get where he was, and he demanded some respect. He wouldn't stand to be belittled by some unknown underground washout if everything she was saying wasn't the irrefutable truth. As much as he instinctively wanted to lash back, he could only stand there and take the vicious dressing down by the positively murderous-looking woman. You're a repugnant piece of garbage of the highest order, and you deserve everything that you get. But your children don't deserve to be put through any more torment just because you lack the humanity to feel any modicum of remorse for the hell you put them through. Of course I do, Endeavor finally bellowed to the furious woman, stopping her rant in its tracks. A brief, startled silence followed between the two as Inko settled between added fury at being interrupted or callous dismissal of his claim. Endeavor, however, continued. I very much do, Endeavor said much more softly. Any time I see you and the pure contempt for me in your eyes, I'm reminded of the hell I put Ray through that eventually caused her to snap. Any time I witness your son in action, I see the great power he possesses and the skill in which he wields it. And I'm confronted with what I forced my children through, what I forced Shoto through. Inko was silent. As taken aback as she was by the sudden admittance of guilt and the genuineness she could feel from it, her face was still set in a frown, and she slowly sat back down to let the man continue confessing his sins. Natsuo won't even speak to me. Fayumi hides it well, but the death of Toya hit her the hardest, and she tries to maintain a strong, positive front by keeping up any semblance of normalcy to keep the family together by any means. Shoto completely rejects me and wants to be his own man, one much more like your son than anything close to me. And Toya? Endeavor's gaze was fixed on the carpet of Nezu's office, and no one uttered a word. The man's flames gradually petered out until his bare face was exposed, and the dry anguish on the man's face spelled nothing but genuine regret. Endeavor had left, and in his place was a downtrodden Enji Todoroki. I failed him most of all, he remarked. I created a family just to one day have my legacy surpass all mights, and I never even accomplished that and lost that family all the while. Inko didn't know how to feel about the admission. On one hand, it felt like too little, too late. The damage was already done. However, on the other hand, it revealed to her that the man wasn't the heartless abomination that she fervently believed him to be. Nezu, meanwhile, watched the proceedings with his smile intact, not making a move to interrupt or calm either of them. He still didn't quite understand humans, so their bouts of emotion were always amusing to him, but he certainly understood pain and could see a lot of it in both of them. That was good, particularly in Endeavor's case, his plan predicated on it. Is all of that genuine? Inko asked the flame hero, and he sullenly nodded. She sighed. If forgiveness is what you're after, then it isn't up to me. It's up to them. I don't deserve forgiveness, he replied, but perhaps I could work to atone. You can start by publicly addressing it, Nezu proposed, and both adults' gazes snapped to him. What? They asked in unison. Nezu's smile grew at a proportional rate to Inko growing unsettled. The best way to begin your path to atonement is to apologize to your family first and foremost, if they're willing to hear you, that is. Then, you must make a public statement about the situation and completely undercut the leverage that the HPSC has over you. Bear in mind that you will have to lay your soul completely bare for public scrutiny, and your reputation will take a critical hit. You will fall down the popularity rankings regardless of if you take a leave of absence or not, and you will never reach your goal of catching up to and surpassing All Might. However, it will be the first major shot fired in the war against government corruption. That's a little extreme, don't you think? Inko hesitantly questioned. I'd rather the kids and Ray not have to deal with the media circus that would cause. It's unorthodox and quite unfortunate, but we can do our best to mitigate the exposure the family at large will have and keep the spotlight on Endeavor himself, Nezu answered. It would do some good to move the conversations about young Shoto away from Stain. Besides, people have been clamoring for more transparency in heroics for decades. This would be a very poignant first step. Inko grunted in tentative acquiescence while Endeavor remained silent, mulling over the thought of coming out and exposing his transgressions to the public. The Chimera was correct that it would torpedo his image likely beyond repair. People would hate him more than many already did. There would be no chance in hell of him overcoming All Might in any capacity. However, thinking only about himself and his aspirations got him and his family to this point. It was no longer about him. It was about protecting his family. If he had to engage in a talking rat's cold war against the government, so be it. I'll do it, Endeavor finally answered, and Inko was giving him a look that he couldn't quite decipher. Excellent, Nezu said with an even sharper smile. Now, shall we begin planning? You know, as much as I love overhaul, I wish the grunt work was a little more exciting, said a thin man with straight, blonde hair and a beak-shaped mask that signified his place among the 8 bullets of the Shy Hasakai. It's part of the job and the opportunities he gifted us, replied a large, bald man wearing a simple medical mask. Yeah, you're right, the blonde conceded as the 2 men and a third wearing a burlap sack over his head watched crates of trigger be loaded onto a truck. Just wish we saw more action these days, you know? Get the blood pumping. Careful what you wish for, you just might get it, the larger man chuckled. Right as he said that, the truck exploded in a blue fireball, and the abandoned warehouse they were behind practically erupted in a sapphire inferno before crumbling into dust. From the blue flames emerged 3 figures, Dabai, Spinner, and Tamura. I'd say I'm sorry for interrupting your haul, but I'm not, Tamura shrugged amongst the chaos. Who are you? The bald man demanded while a layer of hard crystal grew over his skin. Doesn't matter, Tamura said. We're taking the trigger and leaving. Whether or not you live to see us leave is up to you. Like hell, the blonde spat, and the third man wearing the burlap sack leaped into action. His mouth opened wider than any human should be able to manage, and Spinner stepped forward with a comically massive blade fashioned out of rope and many smaller blades. Spinner swung at the burlap-clad man, but the strange man chomped down on the sword and bit a massive chunk out of it, disrupting the integrity of the bindings and causing it to fall apart. The man took advantage and leaped for the walking gecko, but Tamura casually intervened with a palm to the man's head, instantly reducing him to bloody dust. Before the other 2 could react, another wave of blue fire slammed into them, blasting them away from the rest of the trigger. Tamura then calmly placed his hand on the ground, and everything between him and the edge of the property was laid to waste. The concrete ground ruptured and collapsed in on itself as decay quickly spread. Any untouched structures were soon leveled, and any and all stragglers attempting to flee the scene were decayed along with them. The only survivors of the attack were himself, his 2 companions, and 1 crate full of trigger. Tamura moseyed toward the crate and grabbed a handful of the untouched drug before nodding to the other 2. What do we need trigger for, Tamura? Spinner asked as he and Dabai stepped forward to grab handfuls of their own. Our primary target is going to fight back, he answered. Hard. This is just a little insurance policy to complete the mission. Think of it as a simple last resort. When he was satisfied with the haul of their own, he turned away from the destruction they caused and pulled out his phone to call their ride. Kurogiri, get us out of here. As you wish, Tamura. With that, a portal opened in front of them, and the three vacated the scene before any heroes or law enforcement could investigate the ruckus. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey through What If Deku Unleashed God-like Quirk That Surpassed All. I hope you found it as intriguing and thought-provoking as we did. A big shout out to DripBayless for crafting such a compelling story. Don't forget to check out their profile on FanfictionNet for more amazing works. The link is in the description below. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe to What If Deku 2.0 for more fascinating explorations into the world of fanfiction and fantasy. Your support helps us create more content like this, and we're always excited to hear your thoughts and suggestions in the comments section. See you guys in the next video.